Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Was the Son of All Might? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. He's 9 years old when it happens. His teacher's words cut across the medley of the class doing free study. Yagi, you've been called to the principal's office. A wave of silence washed over the class as the words registered to them. All eyes turned to face the corner in which their resident outcast sat, Izuku Yagi. There were few reasons you were called out of class in the middle of the school day. To be called and without the expectation of it usually meant an emergency. A maelstrom of questions began to fill his mind. Did something happen? Was his mother okay? Did something happen at their home? On her way to work? And the worst one that blared front and center in his mind. Had someone found them? As quickly as he could, Izuku began pilling his belongings into his bag. Not quickly enough, though, as the murmurs of the class began to kick up. Doing his best to ignore them, Izuku quickly clipped his backpack closed and quickly rushed to the teacher's desk to receive his pass. Kachin remained silent for the most part, sparing only a set of rolled eyes and a snort as Izuku rushed past his place near the front of the class. He didn't look back, only kept his mind focused on getting to the office. There were a myriads of things that could have gone wrong in this fragile balance of peace his family kept. Izuku knew that countless things could have happened and not one member of his class would expect the half of them. He would come to realize not even he would ever expect this. As quickly as was polite, Izuku grabbed his pass from his homeroom teacher and made a rush out the door, only vaguely registering the explosion of chatter that occurred on his exit. Avoiding anyone else who happened to be in the halls, he quickly made his way to the office, quietly muttering his worries beneath his breath, earning him a few odd looks from any passing teachers or class representatives on errands. His heart threatened to beat through his chest as he finally arrived at the door leading to the main offices. The boy stopped and tried to still his shaking. With his right hand he began to fiddle with a small platinum bracelet he wore concealed under the sleeve of his uniform. With a deep breath he pushed his way into the office, his gaze fixed on the floor. Fear grabbed at his heart and a sinking feeling swam in his gut. Izuku! A premature relief washed over him as his mother's voice reached his ears. Dread returned when he lifted his eyes to see his mother's face. Her eyes and cheeks were red and puffy from crying. Inko's face was puffed and she began sniffling and dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Izuku felt his stomach fall through the floor when his mother spoke again. Izuku, it's your father. Something has happened. Of course his mother was a smart woman and knew any further conversation would have to be held in private. He would later look back and wonder at the blurry memories of his mother thanking the staff and escorting him out of his school and be completely amazed at how calm she had been. Inko guided her son to a familiar sedan waiting in the parking lot and helped him into the back seat. In the driver's seat sat the familiar face of Tsukachi, who turned around to give him a small but soft and comforting smile. He offered no platitudes as his mother got into the passenger seat. Tsukachi offered no comforts. His calm demeanor seemed to be as fragile as Izuku's heart that was currently breaking. Father was in trouble, something about that kept failing to register in the 9-year-old's mind. Completely prepared for villains, ready for his mother to have been hurt in some awful way, never his father. His father almost always seemed invincible and not in the way most children felt their fathers would never come to harm. Izuku struggled with the idea that something happened to his papa to cause Tsukachi and his mother to be so dead silent and tearful. It was the worst he had ever felt in his life. Finally, as they made their way into thicker traffic, his mother spoke up in a shaky voice. Your papa is in a private wing in a hospital in Tokyo. Papa was really hurt in his last fight. Tsukachi volunteered to bring us to Tokyo for him, so that he's not alone. So, he's going to be okay then. Right? The boy tried to smile, but the awful feeling in his stomach refused to go away. Inko pressed her lips together as even more tears threatened to fall. Right hand clenching at her chest, she gave a small shake to her head. Izuku, we're moving to Tokyo to be with Papa as he recovers, and it's really serious, so we're going to be staying there permanently. I know it's really sudden, but we've discussed it before. We thought it would be best to wait till you were older, but now dash. Pausing, Izuku's mother covered her mouth and Squatchy cast her a comforting look before she carried on, her voice almost breaking. Papa really needs us right now. A demon inside of Izuku burst, as the tears he's been fighting began to fall. His body began going numb and started shaking. Papa was so hurt that he needed them with him? Weren't they living apart most of the year for his safety? Papa was so horribly injured that he needed them so bad they were moving permanently, not a vacation. A small selfish voice in his head whispered, "You'll be a real family," but it was extinguished as he began choking on his tears. Papa could be dying. Who, know what on earth could have hurt his father so horribly? It didn't matter, his papa was hurt and all alone in Tokyo. Mama. A lump was stuck his throat and tears poured down his face, but he still stuttered out the words. Mama, how soon can we see Papa? A heartsick and watery almost smile made its way on her face as she whispered out, "Soon, Izuku, we're just going to go home and pack a small bag before we leave." "Okay, sweetie." All he could do was nod. The ride home seemed to go for hours. There was the occasional sniffle and bout of tears from both Izuku and his mother. Tsukachi stayed stalwart and even-faced. Occasionally he looked as if he would break but never did, determined to be a pillar for them just until they could reach Tokyo. Getting home was like a dream. Nothing really seemed real to Izuku as he headed up to their apartment with his mom and Tsukachi. Thought hundreds of miles away as he began packing enough clothing to last a few days into a small duffel. Mostly just going through the motions of packing, Izuku's eyes were focused on his clothing so as not to see the single All Might poster he displayed in his room. But it was futile as he sorted through his shirts and found one with a simple All M splashed across the front. His eyes began to sting again. His right hand clenched the shirt. With a sharp inhale, the boy stuffed it into his bag and closed his eyes. Izuku's right hand once again found the platinum chain that was wrapped around his left wrist. Instead of fiddling with the chain, he simply pressed it into his skin. The comfort of a gift his father had given him over the last summer break. For a few seconds he paused, and did his best to collect himself before packing 2 more pairs of jeans and swiftly leaving his room. When he reached the living room where his mother waited with Tsukachi, Inko made a quick check of his bag to make sure he had enough clothes before they promptly left the small 2-bedroom apartment for the last time. The trio once again piled into Tsukachi's sedan and headed to the train station. It would be hours before Izuku shook the numbness from his skin. The train ride to Tokyo was simultaneously the longest and the shortest it had ever been for Izuku. He had been to Tokyo every holiday since he could remember to see his father, but now it wasn't for a vacation or family time. The fact they had made the journey because his father, the invincible hero, All Might, had been horribly injured continued to churn his stomach. No one around them acted as if they knew a thing about the incident, and distantly he wished that the world wasn't going business as usual. Something was horribly wrong and he just wanted his papa to be okay. Exhaustion was setting in, and slowly but surely he was falling asleep against his mother. Sleep set in and he rested quietly as Inko wrapped a single arm around him to allow her son a semblance of comfortable rest. When he finally woke, he was in the back of a strange car. Vague memories of being carried by Tsukachi off the train drifted through his mind as he shook himself to consciousness. Sleepily, Izuku rubbed at his face. His voice thick, he spoke after a few moments of trying to clear his thoughts. "Mama, when can we see Papa?" Inko turned to her son tiredly and attempted to smile as best she could under the circumstances. "Oh, Izuku, Tsukachi is going to get us something to eat, then we're going to see him, okay?" Nodding as best as an emotionally exhausted 9-year-old could, Izuku began to look out the window and watch all the cars as his mother and Tsukachi decided on the best place to stop before going to the hospital. Settling for something quick, Tsukachi went through the drive-thru of a fast food chain, ordered something small for all 3 of them with the promise of a proper dinner. Izuku nibbled on his food as much as he could. His stomach was still in knots, and his skin still felt cold and stiff. In the end, he ate about half his chicken nuggets and the rest grew cold as they drew closer to the hospital. By the time they arrived at the hospital, it was early evening. Emotional exhaustion was beginning to set into the bones of all 3 members of the traveling party. It was most obvious in the youngest member, whose eyes were half opened and seemed to be holding onto his mother's arm for support. The sole reason Izuku remained awake was his determination to see his father before the end of the day. Steadfastly attached to his mother's arm, he found himself led through the reception area to a more secluded and slow-moving area of the hospital. Tsukachi had the mother and son wait nearby as he spoke to a nurse who was stationed at a nearby kiosk. The woman cast a cursory glance over to the pair before returning to their conversation, nodding, then handing Tsukachi 3 slips of paper. The man returned to them and cast them a small exhausted smile, then handed Inko 2 of the slips he had received. These are for you and Izuku. When his agency checked him in, they had All Might's visitor list limited to a name-only basis. I'm sorry, but you're not on it just in case there was a security breach. As long as you have these, you should be fine for now. Sighing, Tsukachi frowned. If you want to visit again, you're going to have to come with me or Gran Torino. I'm sorry, but there's not really anything I can do about it. Taking the slips, Inko nodded and wiped away a few tears that had gathered at her eyes. Her grip on Izuku tightened slightly. Thank you so much, Tsukachi. We never prepared for something like. She stopped and took a deep breath before continuing. It means so much to me that you're doing all this for us. Tsukachi smiled softly, a genuine affection for the woman before him. You mean the world to me, Inko. All 3 of you do. I would do anything for your family. A few tears fell then, as Inko pressed her lips together and tried her best to smile at him. I'm ready to see him, I think. Take me to All Might. I'm ready to see my dash. She paused, her emotion almost making her forget there were people about. I'm ready to see him now. Tsukachi nodded, then turned to begin leading them through the private wing in which Izuku's father was being kept. The nurse said he got out of surgery a couple hours ago. He's awake now but probably very tired. The doctor might come in while we're here. You can ask him any question about Toshinori's condition. The hum of machines could heard, the beeping of the heart rate monitor steady and constant as they entered the hospital room. A one-person room, a bed hidden by a privacy curtain was at the center. A small television was on top of a wooden stand. In the far left, a door that read, restroom, was cracked open. For a moment no one spoke or moved. Izuku wanted to rush over to his father, but the entire situation was something he had never dealt with. His papa was behind that curtain, hurt, and he was so afraid to see him now that the time was here. Inko was the first to move forward. Slowly she made her way to the privacy curtain and pulled it back gently, almost silent, revealing only the bottom half of the hospital bed, before whispering so delicately and soft, yet full of pain and love. Oh Toshi, my Toshi. Right hand clenched at her chest, Izuku watched as his mother reached forward and touched a familiar hand with her left. Softly and weary with sleep, a voice spoke from behind the curtain. Oh, Inko, you're here early. Red-faced tears began falling freely from her eyes as she grabbed her husband's much larger right hand. Her voice squeaked as she burst out with such a torrent of feelings that Tsukachi flinched. Toshi, you foolish man. Did you think I would wait before coming to see you? A small weak chuckle could be heard before he spoke again. I'm sorry, Inko, I didn't want to worry you so much. Is Izuku here? Inko nodded before turning to look at her son, who had stayed behind next to Tsukachi by the door. Izuku, come say hi to Papa. With a slow reserve, Izuku made his way over to his father's bedside. The boy craned his neck. He tried to see as much as he could before he reached his destination. From what could be seen by the hospital gown his father wore, he was bandaged around his stomach and chest. His arms were also wrapped. Shallow cuts and scrapes were littered across the skin that could be seen. Though he looked tired and worn down, his father would have looked as big and strong as ever before if he hadn't been laying pale in a hospital bed. Small lips trembled and tears stung his dry eyes for what seemed the 100th time that day. The bubble of fear, tension, and sadness in Izuku's chest burst. Papa, I'm so glad you're okay. A quiet, rasping chuckle escaped his father's throat, inciting a coughing fit. Toshinori brought one hand up to cover his mouth with a cloth that seemed to be on hand, and pulled his other from Inko's grasp to clutch his side. Inko quickly looked back and forth worriedly between Tsukachi and her husband, and Izuku's right hand immediately began playing with the platinum chain that was wrapped around his left wrist and concealed by his sleeve. Averting his eyes from the array of blood splatters covering the cloth his father was using to cover his mouth. Shivers began to rack Izuku's small frame. His papa was coughing up blood, and blood was never a good thing. Toshi, are you alright? Should I call the doctor? Inko paled in fear for her husband. He had looked so tired and pale but healthy nonetheless. She was almost fooled into believing that he was okay. Toshinori seemed to attempt to speak before coughing once more. It was Tsukachi who responded by leaving the room calling for a doctor. The coughing fit that had seized Toshinori had seemed to subside as he placed the cloth down and shook his head. The doctor said to expect some blood, but this is ridiculous. He tried to smile, but his exhaustion was evident. She had almost forgotten why they were here in the hospital, that her husband's condition was such that they needed to change their entire plan for their family's future. Nothing was ever going to be the same again. The small voice of her son stuttered, breaking the tension. Papa! Izuku lifted his gaze up from the ground where it had been and walked up close to the bed his father lay in. Placing his hand, as small as most children's that age would be, right on his father's forearm so gently Toshinori barely felt it. There were tears pouring down the boy's face so freely it made Toshinori's heart ache to see his son in such a state because of him. The boy's small cheeks were marred with a cruel red that made his freckles almost disappear. The small hand gripping Toshinori's forearm squeezed with an almost gentle strength. Papa, are you really going to be okay? Toshinori placed his free hand on top of his son's head and looked into his eyes. I'm going to be okay, you know why? Izuku aggressively sniffled and wiped as many tears away as he was able to, so that he could look at his father with clear eyes, even if they were red and puffy. His eyes expectant. Because you and your mama are here. A hopeful warmth flooded Izuku from head to toe, and somehow he knew it would be okay. The door to the room swung open without ceremony as Tsukachi returned with a doctor who seemed calm and unbothered. Clipboard in hand, the man in the white lab coat lifted his eyes from his paperwork and smiled sympathetically at Izuku and his mother. According to Detective Tsukachi, you've worried your visitors all night. Toshinori turned to look at the doctor and did his best to smile. Yes, well, that can't be helped. They hadn't been told how I've been affected. Nodding, the man proceeded. Well then, I'd like to talk to you some more about what's going to come next. Would you like them to leave? I'd like her to stay, but... He paused and glanced at his son, then turned his gaze to his wife. Inko smiled softly, understanding. Izuku, can you wait outside with Tsukachi? Me and All Might are going to talk to the doctor for a bit, okay? The boy looked back and forth at his parents, quickly nodded, then proceeded to leave. Tsukachi waited for Izuku to reach him. Izuku took a small, almost reluctant glance back to his parents, then proceeded to walk to Tsukachi, who then fell into step next to the boy until they were in the hallway and the door was closed. Izuku sat on a chair just outside his father's room and leaned back against the wall, his body relaxed. The weariness he had felt before began setting in. He allowed himself to doze off for the moment, only to be jostled awake what seemed to be only moments later. With one hand gently placed on his shoulder, Inko smiled down at him tenderly. Izuku, it's getting late and Papa has to rest, so go in and say goodbye, okay? We'll see him again tomorrow if we can. Nodding while wiping the sleep from his eyes, Izuku was led to say goodbye. After giving his father a hug, with the assistance of Tsukachi who hoisted him up to the bed, Izuku made the journey with his mother and Tsukachi through the hospital and to the waiting rental car. Once again he fell asleep in the car, and was woken when they arrived to the familiar home that belonged to his father. Having stayed every summer, it was finally the most familiar place he had seen in hours. Grabbing their bags, they made their way to the comfortable 3-bedroom house. Even though Tsukachi had promised them a meal, neither Izuku or Inko had the appetite, so he left them at the door with the promise of being only a phone call away. After placing his bag in his room, Izuku lay on the familiar bed and fell asleep until the next morning. In his first week, Izuku quickly realized that their life had become incredibly hectic. After arriving in Tokyo, he found his mother had moved in a non-stop flurry. Pens, papers, letters, and files were flying back and forth between the bookshelf, filing cabinet, and her place at the kitchen table. Izuku found that his mama was up at seemingly the crack of dawn to begin working. His stomach would churn uncomfortably when he saw that she was constantly in such a tizzy, between phone calls and getting meals prepared for him. On top of all the work his mother needed to accomplish, in 2 days she said she would have to return to their old apartment for what she kept calling business. Izuku was already having a hard time settling in, worrying about his father who was still in the hospital when everyone insisted he would be fine. Watching his mother running around looking exhausted was beginning to tire him out. Even though she had promised she would take him, he couldn't bring himself to ask her to go see his papa. He felt bad enough that he could barely help her with much of the work that had to be done around the house. He knew she probably felt worse than he did, so couldn't help worrying about her. Izuku was pretty sure that she thought he didn't notice, but he didn't think she was actually sleeping. Izuku had heard her the first 2 nights wandering around the house. He had heard her in the kitchen, rummaging through the cabinets. At first he had jolted awake, his blood ran cold as he heard the noises of someone in their home. Creeping out of bed he has slowly made his way to the room his parents shared, but when something had fell, it was his mother's voice he heard make a startled cry. Slowly he'd tiptoed and peeked into the living room and caught a glimpse of her in her nightshirt and sweatpants, wandering the kitchen with only the stove top light on. At first he'd been confused, relieved it wasn't a villain that had broken in, but confused at why his mother would be up so late. Then, when it had happened again the next night, he'd become uneasy. The worry only set in last night, because last night was the worst. At around 1 o'clock in the morning, according to his clock, he had woken up to hear crying softly in what sounded like the living room. After that he couldn't go back to sleep until she had stopped. Laying in bed he'd heard his mother weep, and he couldn't do anything, he couldn't move his body. And before he knew what was happening he was crying too. Crying because his mama had become so sad in such a short time, crying because his papa was in the hospital and was probably just as sad and lonely as his mama. Crying because Izuku felt that if he went out there, he couldn't help at all. Feeling pathetic, all he could do was cry silently, until his mother's tears had subsided, and she'd went to bed. It had taken much longer for him to fall back asleep after that. He did his best to find comfort in the bracelet he wore, but the chill of it seemed to make him feel worse instead of soothe him as it usually did. On their 4th evening in Tokyo he decided to take action, slipping into the kitchen about the time his mother tended to start dinner, and wandering over to where she was going over some sort of paperwork. He smiled brightly and tried to sound as earnest as he could. "Mama," he began, her head almost instantly lifted, surprised that her son had interrupted her work. Normally he would just wait for her to finish whatever she had started before asking her for anything he might need. She sent a quick glance to the clock and sighed, realizing that it was about time to make dinner and that Izuku was probably interrupting her because he was hungry. "What do you need, Izuku?" She tried to smile, but it was slightly strained. "Can you teach me how to make eggs over rice?" he chirped, happily. It was a simple dish, he knew it wouldn't take too much work from her and maybe it would almost be like a break for her. Secretly he hoped in his heart that if she could teach him how to cook it, he could even make dinner for her later as a surprise. "I even saw some green onions in the fridge for an extra topping. Please, Mama?" His mother was a smart woman. A pain clenched at her chest, tears began gathering in her eyes. Struggling with the wave of warmth she felt for her son, she spoke almost inaudibly. "Yes, I can." The deep affection she felt was beginning to overflow inside of her as Izuku looked at her with absolute excitement. "You can start by getting the cup measure from the drawer next to the sink and putting 2 scoops in the rice cooker on the counter, okay?" Izuku nodded, thrilled at the prospect, and did as she told him. By the time he was done with that, his mother had grabbed a large cup of water and joined him by the rice cooker. "See this line?" His mama pointed to one of the lines on the inside of the rice cooker just above the rice Izuku had just poured in. She continued, "Pour some water until it reaches that line, all right?" Handing him the cup, she watched as he gripped it with 2 hands and poured it into the cooker. Closing it and setting the timer, he started it and smiled up at his mother. She smiled back, real soft smile. That night when he went to bed, he didn't get up until his alarm went off. In the morning he asked her to teach him how to use the egg cooker. 6 days into their arrival, it was a Saturday and the smell of egg mixed with vegetables filled the air. And since last night his mother had said she would leave for their old home that morning, he knew it was probably Gran Torino, or as he called him, Grandpa, preparing breakfast for the 2 of them. Changing into clothes for the day, Izuku wandered out of his room and followed the scent of food. Absently, he noticed about 8 boxes in the living room stacked against the wall next to the front door. Each box had either his or his mother's name scribbled inelegantly in black permanent marker. Deciding to worry about the boxes later, he decided food and tea was more important at the moment. Wandering into the kitchen, he yawned loudly and stretched his arms. Voice full of sleep, he spoke. "Whatcha making, Grandpa?" He heard a familiar chuckle and a reply that was decidedly not his grandpa. "It's just an omelet, and your grandpa got held up so your mother called me instead." Startled, Izuku squeaked, then flushed a bright red, as he opened his eyes to find his uncle Tsukachi. "Oh." Izuku smiled shyly. "I thought you were working today." "Not that I'm not happy to see you," he backtracked and became even more embarrassed. Luckily for him, his uncle was used to his antics by now. Tsukachi just chuckled. "I took a couple days off to help Gran Torino get your stuff over here." He nodded his head to the direction of the living room. "The two of us brought those boxes over early this morning. He had to go to your father's agency to meet some heroes after that. You should be spending the rest of the weekend with him." Izuku made his way to the dining table and got comfortable, thinking about what Tsukachi had said. Knowing his mother was supposed to be back on Tuesday, he figured he had some time to sort through his belongings they had brought before she returned. They breakfast, and the rest of the morning saw Izuku unpacking. There were 4 boxes that his grandpa and Uncle Tsukachi had brought him. The largest box was about the same size as he was, had the same permanent marker scribbled on it messily proclaiming it was clothing. The second largest said, toys. The third was long and said, posters. The smallest and last was written more cleanly said, desk. Izuku had decided to start with the clothing box and the sheer quantity of clothing startled him, so with apprehension he started sorting everything into piles by type. Shirts, pants, underthings, pajamas, and things that needed to go hanging in the closet. Soon his room seemed to be covered in clothing he had no idea that he had even owned. How did he even own 12 All Might shirts? Izuku knew he occasionally asked his mom for one for the fun of wearing it and having a secret, but 12 shirts with his papa's face and or name on them was absolutely ridiculous. Deciding on dealing with those after everything else was put away, Izuku placed the 12 shirts in a pile and started on the others. Hanging up the one dress shirt he owned right next to his yukata and other hero print shirts, and folding anything else. As for his pants, he hung all of them with the exception of the denim and the various sweatpants he used as pajamas. His underthings he just threw into the drawer. By the time he was finished with everything it was the afternoon. Deciding to get a snack, Izuku grabbed his current analysis notebook along with a pen and left his room, making his way to the kitchen. As he passed through the living room, it seemed his uncle Tsukachi was reading a novel of some sort while lounging on the couch. Reaching the kitchen, Izuku began looking through the pantry. He decided on an orange that sat in a basket in the back of the small room of food. After he peeled it, he tossed the rinds in the trash and placed the fruit on a napkin. Sidling up to the kitchen table with his loot, Izuku ate his orange silently, then made his way to the living room. Sat on the couch next to Tsukachi, and turned on the TV to begin his search for the noon report, or any reviews he could find of incidents that may have occurred that morning. When he found a station that was reporting on a battle between Cementos and a flying villain, he left it to play. Opening his analysis journal, Izuku began adding another entry for Cementos as he watched the highlight reel. He was still writing about the incident and humming a summer tune that had become stuck in his head when it happened. As Tsukachi lay sprawled across the sofa in the living room, book forgotten now that he was watching the news, Grandpa burst through the front door with all the enthusiasm of a freight train. For Izuku, this was a normal occurrence when he stayed in Tokyo. What made the situation strange was the man who followed calmly. The armored hero Ingenium entered their living room with all the grace a man following Gran Torino's jetting around could. "Hello. Look who I found when I was out getting seaweed." Grandpa greeted enthusiastically and waved at them through the doorway. Tsukachi jumped in surprise and vaulted over the sofa he had been laying on, ducking behind the sofa, and Izuku dropped his pencil, letting out a loud screech. Suddenly realizing that it was Gran Torino and a guest, Tsukachi composed himself, standing and lifting a hand in greeting. "Hello. I'm Nemoasa Tsukachi." Gran Torino just laughed heartily. "This is Tsukachi. He's All Might's friend. Detective, this is just Ingenium. We'll be seeing a lot of him. He'll be covering this area of town while All Might recovers. Tsukachi nodded slowly, hoping that Gran Torino would never bring someone Toshinori didn't approve of into the house when Izuku was there. Ingenium nodded and greeted the detective with an easy and relaxed smile. "It's nice to meet you, sir." Tsukachi nodded and returned to his place on the couch, this time in more of a proper sitting position. As Izuku beamed brightly at the pro-hero standing in their living room, Gran Torino patted the hero's arm, before gesturing to Izuku, continuing the introduction. "This here is All Might's son." Ingenium seemed to pause in surprise. "I didn't realize he had a son, but it's a pleasure nonetheless if I'm allowed. May I ask your name?" Izuku began to reply, but before he could, Grandpa answered for him. "Not today, my friend. Let's get you something to eat and get you back out on the prowl, okay?" Accepting their desire for privacy, the pro-hero nodded and followed the older man for a quick afternoon meal. Izuku did his best not to stare as the pro-hero he had written a whole 5 pages on in one of his notebooks ate taiyaki with his grandpa. Too shy to ask questions, he just cast furtive glances, continued to write in his notebook, and tried to finish his entry. Was this going to be normal from now on? Were pro-heroes always waltzing in and out of this house? How come it had never happened when he'd stayed before? A million questions swirled through his mind as the hero ate with his grandpa. True to his word, Gran Torino and Ingenium only took about 12 minutes to eat and were on their way out. Before they left, though, Ingenium stopped, turned to Izuku and smiled brightly, saying, "I have a brother about your age. Maybe if your parents are okay with it, I could introduce you." Izuku was frozen, vibrating with excitement. Vigorously he nodded, feeling as if he was about to explode from excitement. Gran Torino just huffed and practically began to shove the younger hero out the door. "Leave my grandson alone, and ask All Might and the boy's mother later like a proper adult." Ingenium just laughed heartily and let himself be shoved. Izuku could hear the hero's voice fading as he said, "Sorry, now that I think about it, that was pretty rude of me to ask him instead of his parents. I was just excited about his age. You know, my brother has a hard time getting along with other kids." Staring at the spot they had vacated, Izuku wondered what he would do with himself if pro-heroes began traipsing into their house like this on a regular basis. On Sunday, the day before his mother would return from her trip, Grandpa had woke Izuku up by jetting into the room and bouncing onto his bed. Loudly, the retired hero declared, "If you don't wake up, you won't get to feed the ducks later, come on." Jolted out of his sleep, Izuku screamed as he sat upright, then in his tussle with the blanket, promptly fell onto the floor with an unceremonious thud. Rubbing his thigh, he wondered how bad the bruise would be, and tried to shake the sleep that grogged his head. "Waducks, what are you doing in my room?" Gran Torino chuckled boisterously as he hopped of the bed and began to inspect Izuku for any bad injuries. "Waking you up, of course. Why else would I come in here and tell you to wake up?" When his grandpa found nothing more than a bump, Izuku stood up. Finally, the sleep was clearing from his mind to normal morning levels. "And the ducks?" he asked curiously. Every time he had stayed with his papa in Tokyo, Grandpa had insisted on taking him somewhere. It was never extravagant like Disneyland or Universal. Their trip were mostly for food or natural sights. The last time he had visited, Grandpa had taken him to the Imperial Palace East Gardens. So Izuku's morning-addled brain assumed that's where the ducks were coming in. They probably had something to do with what Grandpa had planned for the day. Being honest with himself, Izuku was surprised that his grandpa even wanted to go anywhere with the situation being what it was. He had expected to pass the weekend quietly, but as was the older man's habit, he'd decided to make the best of the situation. So it was with a bounce in his grandpa's step, and a bit of apprehension in his own that they made their way down the street. They carved themselves a path following the traffic of the other pedestrians, some rushed around running errands, the others making deliveries of packages, going to work. The variety was endless really. The life bustled everywhere Izuku looked. His grandpa gripped his hand and cast him a smile. "Just hold on to me, okay? I'll make sure you don't get lost." Izuku just nodded and let his grandpa lead him down the lively streets. Some shops seemed familiar and others didn't, but regardless, he kept close to his grandpa and the only part of him he allowed to wander was his eyes. As the two walked, part of Izuku wanted to ask how his papa was doing, but he knew no one really liked to talk about it. Every time he had asked, he was answered with a simple, "He's fine, don't worry." Yet, he knew that wasn't true. If his papa was fine, then he'd be home. He and his mother wouldn't have come to Tokyo until his summer break. So, his worries about his papa began growing silently. While he mused in his head, he began to focus unseeingly ahead, scrunching his face together. Abruptly, he found himself yanked by his grandpa into a halt. They'd stopped in order to fall into a line that had formed in front of a cart that seemed to be selling food. Izuku looked around to find he had been led into a shopping center. He sniffed and pursed his lips in thought, trying to puzzle out what they had stopped for. Gran Torino seemed to have noticed and laughed heartily at the boy's antics. "We're grabbing some lunch. This shop has the best taiyaki, so we'll grab some here and take a train to a park where we'll eat, okay?" With a nod, Izuku smiled. Whenever he and his grandpa went for a jaunt and they bought taiyaki, Izuku always chose a greater variety than the retired hero because he liked mixing them and guessing the filling before taking a bite. After the two of them had purchased a ridiculous amount of taiyaki and made their way at a relaxed pace to the train station. "Grandpa," Izuku began, then stopped himself. The boy's gaze nervously went to the floor. He remained silent, thinking better of the thoughts that had been slowly growing. The worry for his father, this supposedly carefree jaunt through the city. Shouldn't he be visiting his papa? Shouldn't he be doing something? Tears began forming in his eyes as he sniffled and tried to choke down the sob that was forming in his throat. He always felt so useless. "Izuku." Gran Torino stopped walking, not caring about the people who passed them, and shot curious glances. "Izuku, tell me why you're crying." The boy looked up, and as his gaze met the aged hero, all the emotions that he had built up about his father, the feelings of distance and loneliness that had slowly been building since the move, the worry for his mother Izuku thought he had already dealt with, all of it came crashing down in a great sob. His shoulders slumped and he wept. "Everyone is saying Papa is okay, but he's not. He'd be home if he was, and he's not. Mama can't sleep and all I do is write in my notebook and I can't make her feel better. And I'm scared. I want Papa to be home and Mama to be happy, but I can't do anything." Before he had even finished sobbing out the words, Gran Torino reached out and hugged the boy to himself tightly. To the older man it was awkward and something he wasn't accustomed to, but he knew Toshinori frequently hugged the boy when he became distressed. Toshinori always gave Izuku tactile affection, but Toshinori wasn't here, so the old hero figured he himself would have to do. So he held his grandson tightly and let him cry. When Izuku reached back and held on tightly around him, Gran Torino was relieved that he could offer the boy some comfort, even if it offered the embarrassment of being seen in such an embrace in such a public place. Gran Torino waited for the boy's sobs to calm before speaking the most soothing way he could. "I tell you not to worry, but you're the kind that would go on worrying anyways. You are still a little boy, Izuku, and I'm going to tell you this. Your mama and papa are really worried just like you are." Taking a moment, he pulled away slightly so that he could look at his grandson. "For now, all your parents want is to make sure you're happy and that everything that's happened isn't having a bad effect on you. So that's why your papa asked me to take you to see the ducks, so that you can have a day of no worries, something you're used to." For a moment Izuku stuttered, then spoke. "Papa asked you to bring me?" Gran Torino nodded. "He wanted to take you this summer, but with the accident he probably won't be able to for a while. So, make sure you have a good time, okay? You can tell him all about the fun you had when we visit him on Tuesday, okay?" Wiping the tears from his eyes, Izuku gathered himself with a new determination and nodded firmly. With a soft smile, Gran Torino ruffled the boy's hair once more. "Alrighty then, are you ready, or do you need more time to pull together? Just give me a moment. I'll be ready right now," Izuku promised, doing his best to remain determined as tears began gathering in his eyes anew. "I just want to make sure I can focus on our good time. I don't want to cry again." The older man chuckled softly and shook his head. This boy was such a roller coaster sometimes. Once Izuku was ready, the two made their way to the station and boarded the train to Shinabazu Pond in Ueno Park. Holding a bag of warm taiyaki on a crowded train was, interestingly enough, something that Izuku was familiar with. So letting himself sit in the moment of normalcy, he listened to his grandpa tell him all about the wildlife that made their home in the pond they were about to visit. Grandpa smiled and gestured with one hand as the other held his bag of food. See, there are some alligators just showed up about a decade back and now there are warning signs. There are snapping turtles too, so be careful. We're going to be going there for the ducks though, nice little critters. If you want you can feed them bread, but we're really going to just enjoy the view, okay? Izuku nodded with a small smile. He had always enjoyed time with his grandpa. The man always brought him to the most interesting places. Do you think alligators like red bean paste? Izuku pondered while looking into his bag of taiyaki. The retired hero laughed as he shook his head. Izuku, boy, if you try and feed the alligators your mother is going to kill me, so please try to resist it no matter how tempting it may seem. I wasn't gonna try it. Izuku protested with a blush. I didn't even mean to say it out loud. That just caused his grandpa to laugh again, before patting him on the head with his free hand. In any case, feeding the animals your taiyaki would be a waste. There is probably a place to get bird feed or bread nearby if you really want to feed them. Nodding happily, Izuku reached into his bag for one of his snacks. Examining it, he smiled and said, "Potato." Biting into it, he found it was one of the ones with meat filling. He'd been wrong, but the savory flavor was still satisfying. The train stopped a small time after he had finished his first snack, and the two walked leisurely to their destination. Gran Toriono pointed out different places he'd been and told stories about times he'd been in the area. Izuku found himself contentedly following along. Having a good cry had really helped, no matter how embarrassing he thought it was now that it was over. Reaching the park, he found it full of people who were enjoying the sights and the wildlife as they had come for. Sticking close to his grandpa, he was led to a bench along the pond. Gran Torino perched himself on the bench and patted the seat next to him, prompting Izuku to join him. The two set their bags of food between them and enjoyed their meal as they watched the ducks, who seemed to be either fishing or searching for food along the shores that any passerby may be offering. Izuku listened as his grandpa told him about all the types of ducks there were, and how they only came certain time a year. He enjoyed his taiyaki and for a moment pretended that he was in Tokyo because he was on vacation. That everything was as it had always been. Izuku closed his eyes and let it go. This right here, enjoying taiyaki in Shinabazu Pond in Tokyo, he wanted to do this again. Izuku! His grandpa's voice called in concern. Snapping out of his thoughts, Izuku flushed a bright red. I'm sorry, I was just... Gran Torino smiled. It's okay, my boy, you've got a lot of thinking to do and it's fine. I was just worried I'd lost you again for a second. Izuku nodded then smiled. All of a sudden, without his permission, his mouth spoke. I want to come here with Papa when he's better. He flushed again and his grandpa patted him on the head gently and smiled softly. I think he'd like that, Izuku. Make sure to tell him that, okay? Izuku nodded enthusiastically with some embarrassment. Yes, sir. Between visits to his father, unpacking, and generally just absorbing the fact that they were here in Tokyo permanently, Izuku's time flew by quickly. And before he knew it, 3 weeks had passed since he's begun living in his father's home, and his mother was sitting down to tell him the plan she and his father had made for their future here. She smiled and held his hand before telling him he'd be returning to school in 4 days on the upcoming Monday. That was fine. He knew he would have to return eventually, and even though it was daunting to be thrown into a new place, full of strangers, he had long ago decided that he was going to be a hero as brave as his father. So he considered this training of a sort, braving new circumstances. So, with complete apprehension, he nodded and agreed that he was ready, even though he knew he probably wouldn't be even if she had asked him 10 years from now. His mother nodded and smiled nervously before speaking more on the subject. Your papa and I have chosen a private school that we think will keep you as safe as possible. Lots of heroes have sent their kids there. Some of them may already know about you. So it shouldn't be a problem. Not that you should go around telling everyone who your father is. Okay. You private school? Izuku screeched and turned a bright red, embarrassed at his own outburst. His mind was going 100 miles a minute. He'd always been so used to going to a school that was so far away from this part of his life. All of his classmates had been from a completely different world where he was just quirkless Deku. Now, he was going to start going to a private school. full of other kids whose parents might also be pro-hero. It was so much to think about. This meant that he might make a friend, someone who he could tell all about his family. He'd never had anyone like that before. Kacchan had been the only friend that had come close. It had seemed it was wise that his mama had told him to wait, but still, the part of his life that had been "my dad is number one hero all might" had always seemed like something that would always be a secret only he and his mother would know. The possibility that other kids may find out was so alien. How would everyone view him? The quirkless son of All Might. An icy fear grabbed his heart. What am I going to tell everyone? Izuku gasped, absolute terror in his eyes. His mother wrapped an arm around him compassionately. You'll be fine. The only children that will know who your father is will only know because they have family that are also heroes and have worked very closely with him. They know it's not something they should go around telling everyone. She paused thoughtfully, then continued, even then, none of them may even be in your class. I mean about my quirk. Izuku squeaked. He could feel tears gathering. He'd promised himself he'd never feel ashamed of being quirkless, and he'd kept that promise for years. But now, people were going to look at him and see his father, then see someone who was nothing but a failure. Inko frowned in a particular way that Izuku knew very well. It meant his wonderful mama and papa were probably about to ask him to circumvent to truth, as his mother would call it. It was never a lie. His papa and mama would never have him lie. They'd have him prepare answers. Like when kids at school would ask where his father was, Izuku would just reply, working in Tokyo. When they'd ask what he did, Izuku would just say, he's trying to be a hero. Kids would laugh and jeer, and talk behind his back about the must-be failed hero who didn't live at home. Back there they knew he was quirkless. Back there he'd struggled with being a target with no father to speak of. Some of them even called him a liar. They'd say his father ran away. It never bothered him much what kids said until Kacchan started saying them too. The one boy who was supposed to be his friend. Izuku never blamed his parents for other children being cruel. He knew if he'd had a quirk like either of them it would never have happened. But it did, and whatever his mother was about to ask him to say, he hoped it wouldn't lead to more children being cruel. Inko sighed and replied gently, tell them you're not allowed to talk about it. Tell them me and your papa have told you not to. Izuku's brain halted and his mouth kind of just hung open just a tiny bit. His mother wasn't looking at him, her eyes were focused just over his shoulder and her face looked slightly pinched. If he told people that, then... But they'll think I have papa's quirk since he's so secretive about it. Mama, I can't do that. He was panicking now, his voice was at a screech and he wasn't even embarrassed. Inko closed her eyes, inhaled, and then exhaled slowly when she opened them and looked at her son with so much love it made Izuku's heart ache. Her voice soft when she spoke. They can think what they want, but we can't have villains knowing you don't have a quirk, Izuku. She smiled at him, the best comforting smile she could muster. Izuku could tell she wasn't exactly pleased about the situation either. It's safer this way, we can't dash. She stopped, then began again. Izuku, you can't control what people think. You're telling them you can't talk about you being quirkless because it's dangerous. Let them think what they want. Inko muttered under her breath and Izuku pretended that he didn't hear the words. They did it before and they'll do it again. For the first time Izuku wondered what people had said to his poor mother, and shook those thoughts away. Not trusting his voice, Izuku nodded and leaned into his mother, and hoped that his papa would be home soon. Inko held her son for a short time and kissed his hair before offering some more words of comfort and apology. I'm sorry that so much has changed and it all happened so quickly, but you know me and your father are willing to listen if it's too much. You know that, right, honey? His mama smiled at him reassuringly. A gentle warmth filled him, and tears began to fall from his eyes as an overwhelming happiness swept over him. Because no matter what happened, his parents would always be there. Not knowing how to say it, Izuku simply nodded and poured all his love for his mother in the words, "Yes, Mama." Having to spend days on end in a hospital bed, a hole through his abdomen, and with nothing better to do than count the tiles on the floor and ceiling, was not the way Toshinori had wanted to spend the next few months. Of course, he knew his fight with All for One was necessary. He knew All for One was in just as bad, if not worse shape than he was. Yet, he had started feeling anxious about his predicament about halfway through the second morning of his stay. His wife and son had moved all the way out to Tokyo to be there with him. It was the best choice. Toshinori's doctors had already made it very clear they didn't want him to be alone from now on. So why did he feel so guilty and angry about the whole ordeal? Though, in the end, the predicament he found himself in was out of his control, he still felt immensely guilty for causing his family such a fright. He couldn't even imagine how scared and angry he would be if something had happened to Inko and Izuku. Then again, Inko was probably faring better than he ever would have. She had always been the stronger one. Laying in bed, he had spent a lot of time thinking and generally feeling guilty about the pressure he had brought upon his wife. He was beginning to feel pathetic about the entire situation. Toshinori's mind kept going back to when his wife had been to see him that first time. The doctor had come to discuss with them what would need to be done beyond the immediate surgeries he had undergone when he had been delivered to the hospital by Sir Night-Eye directly after his fight. The doctor had said he predicted at least 5 to 7 more surgeries were needed before they were sure his body could be deemed sound enough to be left to recover. His body had taken a lot, and he could practically feel himself growing weaker. There was no way he would be able to maintain his strict training with the diet he would be given. Toshinori had no illusions about the situation. Those 7 surgeries were the minimum. There was no telling what other problems would pop up later as a result of his condition. He couldn't possibly retire, that was out of the question. Perhaps he could use one for all as sparingly as he could as he recovered, so his body would still be accustomed to the strain? Toshinori hated being left to his thoughts. Most of the things he considered were best left to when he was out of the hospital and back in his home with his family. Knowing they were so close had already relieved him considerably. Izuku was already at the age where Toshinori would really have to ask himself the hard questions. What would be his quirkless son's fate? And all the implications of that thought scared him, which made it best suited for a later date. Toshinori counted the tiles on the roof of his room again to distract himself. About noon, Toshinori could hear the sound of footsteps approaching his room. He sighed as he felt the pain of his wound moving as he used the control panel next to his right hand to make the hospital bed slide upwards into an almost sitting position. Expecting a nurse with his lunch, he was pleasantly surprised to see his wife enter with a soft smile on her face, their son clutching her hand, the two of them followed by Gran Torino. Feeling a rush of affection for his family, he smiled back. Toshinori's gaze was fixed on his wife. He inspected her face, looking for any trace or hint of the stress she was under. Inko bore the situation so well. Pride filled his heart at the dignity, grace, and strength she was displaying. "How have you two been holding up?" Inko sighed and settled in a chair near his bed as Izuku was given a chair by his grandpa. After she settled, she turned back to her husband and replied, "As best we can until you get home. There's still a lot of mayhem, but I'm sure we've borne the worst of it." "I'm so proud of you too. I honestly don't think I could do what you are doing," Toshinori confessed. Toshinori stretched out his hand in an offering of comfort. Inko returned the gesture and tangled their fingers together, leaving them entwined. The couple let their hands rest on the side of the hospital bed. Inko smiled and shook her head shyly. "Toshi, please, as hard as it is, I knew it was coming to this eventually. Not you being injured but us moving to be with you. We talked about it, and well, as much as the circumstances hurt, I am glad we can be with you." He turned his attention to his son, who was in a deep conversation with Gran Torino about an entry in his hero analysis notebook. Toshinori's old teacher seemed to be instructing Izuku on what to jot down as he scribbled furiously. "I see you're keeping my son for yourself then," he joked, gaining the attention of the two who had been huddled together in discussion. "There was a villain attack on Outway here, and Ingenium and Edgeshot showed up, and it was so cool." Izuku enthused, practically bouncing as he made his way over to be closer to his parents. "Will I ever get to see you working up close, Papa?" Toshinori smiled, filled with warmth at his son's antics. The boy had always loved heroics and the heroes that performed them. Izuku had such a bright light and a warm heart that had been somewhat dimmed when they'd been told by Recovery Girl he was quirkless. Even more so when that Bakuga boy, who had really been Izuku's only friend, really turned on him and became his bully. So much had happened since the initial discovery of his condition, and yet Izuku still did his best, still striving to be permitted to become a hero. Here they were now. Toshinori himself laid up in bed, damaged so irreparably it would shake the pillars of society, and yet his small son still pushed on and smiled about the heroes in the streets that he'd wrote about in his notebook. He's looked back on day and know that in his heart it was that moment he'd made the decision, but his mind still would need to find a reason to justify it. But they'd push through. So Toshinori pulled his hand out of Inko's grasp and ruffled his son's hair and chuckled brightly, shaking thoughts of his son's resilience away. I don't know about any time soon, my boy, but when I'm better and you're older. Well, maybe. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see his wife smiling at the two of them, and so he turned and smiled back at her with a silly wink. And according to the doctors, it may be sooner rather than later, isn't that right, darling? His wife chimed in knowingly. Ah, yes. Toshinori turned his attention back to Izuku. It seems I won't be able to have any more surgeries done until I've had a PRD of rest and recovery. So they're sending me home in about a week. The hope in the boy's eyes made them sparkle, and Toshinori almost sighed, but instead he continued. I'll have to stay in bed most of the time, Izuku, but being home will really help a lot, and Recovery Girl is going to have to check on me frequently. But you'll be home, right? Izuku pressed forward, the upper half of his body leaning on the bed, his little hands grabbing the sheets in excitement. For a bit, yes. Toshinori smiled. I'll have to come back here eventually, but in a week or so I'll be home for some time. The look on his son's face made the injured hero not even care that his reprieve from the hospital was only temporary. For the last few days before he'd begin his new school life, Izuku spent more time with his grandpa, running through the things he wasn't allowed to talk about with his future classmates. Most of it was the same as when he'd gone to public school in their home away from his father. Some of it was new. You won't be permitted to invite anyone over unless they've been approved of by me or your father. Gran Torino announced one day over one of their celebrity training sessions, as the older hero called them. But you brought Ingenium here. Izuku protested in an embarrassing, unrestrained blurt. That's because both me and your father know him, we both trust him. I'd asked him if I could bring him over beforehand as well. I may be spontaneous and reckless when I want to be, but not when it comes to you and your mom's safety. Grandpa explained. I'm not saying you can't make friends, but before you can go to their house or they can come here, you have to ask. After we've said yes once, it should be fine and you shouldn't have to ask again. If that changes, we'll tell you okay, and be smart. I know you've got a really big brain in there most of the time. The hero then lightly bopped him on the head and chuckled at the meek expression the boy gave him. So if you got a friend that we said yes to already, but you don't know if it's a good idea to have them over on a certain day, then use your brain and make a choice, okay? When Izuku nodded, he felt a knot in his stomach. So if Papa is having a bad day and is feeling really bad, I shouldn't have someone over, but if he's just in his and Mama's room watching the news, it'd be okay? With the gift of a proud smile from his grandpa, he knew he'd made the right deduction. A small voice reminded him that this would only matter if he made friends, but he squashed it down. This was new school, a new beginning, and he'd take it with both hands and a smile, just as his father had always taught him to do. At least that's what he kept promising himself. In seemingly a blink of an eye, he was waking up early and getting dressed in his new uniform and leaving home for Korsun Academy. Inko held onto Izuku's hand the whole way on the train and to the front office of Korsun Academy. Izuku himself was vibrating with nervous energy as they entered the building and walked the path to the administration's office. He paid a passing glance to all the children around his age playing in yard. Something so familiar in such a foreign setting made something settle in his stomach, and he wasn't quite sure if he liked it or not. Once the pair reached their goal, the principal, a rather tall and plump woman with skin as dark as the night that sparkled with what seemed like small sprinkling of diamond across her entire body, greeted them rather enthusiastically. Welcome, Mrs. Yagi. And little Mr. Yagi too. Her bright smile eased some of Izuku's nerves, but his mother seemed all the same as before. I'm Principal Shoku. Please take care of my son, his mother requested earnestly with a suitable bow. The other woman's face grew soft, then lit up again. Of course, Mrs. Yagi. We do our absolute best to care for all our students. Most of them are our future. Be it in heroics or business, only the best come here. She enthused. I'll be escorting Izuku to class myself. Then leaning forward in a hammy stage whisper she continued, "He is our new golden VIP." Inko then turned to her son and smiled and encouragingly as she could muster, "Izuku, are you ready to go with Principal Shoku?" Upon hearing the words, golden VIE, he'd grown nervous. He'd not realized the teachers would know who he was. They would have to know if they were going to protect what his brain was calling the most at risk in case of attack children. So steeling his nerves he nodded. His mother kissed him on the forehead heedless of what anyone thought, then handed him over to Principal Shoku, who then led him from the office. Izuku waved at his mother before the office door closed behind him and let the principal lead him to his new classroom. "I couldn't believe it when they told me," the woman began speaking again, her speech just as bubbly as it was before. "The number one himself's son under our care. Well, Yagi, I'll tell you right now that the only place safer for you than here is by your father's side." Izuku's brain was feeling pragmatic and supplied that UA was probably safer, but that was neither here and he was definitely not there, so he silently continued to follow the strange woman. Albeit a bit uncomfortably. Though the halls were empty, he'd had discretion drilled into him the past few days and the principal's display was messing with his brain. "You're going to be in class 1 right here." The woman smiled as they stopped in front of a door labeled as she'd said. Principal Shoku opened the door and allowed him to walk in silently. His mother had brought him quite early, so the only occupant of the classroom seemed to be a rather plain and tall woman. "The teacher. Mrs. Nitta." Principal Shoku chimed, gaining the other woman's attention. "Ah, Principal." The plain woman smiled for a moment in greeting before taking notice of Izuku, who had begun doing his best impression of a chameleon and was practically clinging to the doorway. "This is Yagi. You will be teaching him from now on, he's very important." The principal smiled broadly. "Yagi, this is your teacher Mrs. Nitta." Not really knowing what else to do, Izuku simply bowed as respectfully as he could and said, "Please take care of me." Mrs. Nitta smiled far more kindly than the principal had up until now, and Izuku relaxed a bit. "Well, Yagi, you can sit right in the back corner by the bookshelf on the left right." Nodding, the boy rushed away from his guide and began setting up his things in his new seat. Mrs. Nitta nodded once and then turned back to her attention back to the principal, who had watched the whole exchange happily. "Well, I'll leave you to it then." Principal Shoku nodded once and promptly left. Izuku watched his new teacher as he set up his desk. She seemed quite content with getting her things together and leaving him be for some time. Until it was almost time for the bell. That was when she turned her attention to him and asked, "When I have you introduce yourself, is it okay if you tell everyone your quirk?" Izuku looked up at her from his notebook he had been drawing in, and shook his head in the negative. Her eyes widened slightly, but she collected herself and nodded almost sagely. It was already starting and he hadn't even actually started school yet. His lungs felt tight, but he exhaled and started playing with his bracelet. It calmed him a bit, but he didn't think there was really anything that could calm him completely, not right now. Before any more questions could come, the bell rang and children his age began filing into the classroom and into their designated seats. The boy did his best to look around and try to spot the more obvious quirks, thinking that perhaps he could connect one of his classmates with a hero. Part of him hoped beyond hope that there would be someone. Another part was scared beyond belief of the prospect. Children kept filing in until there was about 15 or so. That was when the second bell rang and Mrs. Nitta closed the door. Immediately, under her kind but authoritative tone, the children of Class 1 were calmed and settled into their chairs. One or two had taken notice of him, but Izuku was far in the back and rather determined to remain unnoticed until he absolutely had to be. The teacher smiled and addressed the room. "Before we start, I'd like you all to meet our new classmate." She gestured over to Izuku and he stood in front of everyone, his hands shaking and stomach clenched. "I'm Izuku Yagi." The boy managed to sputter out. Immediately he sat down and tried to collect himself. Mrs. Nitta spoke again, addressing someone in particular, "Yayorozu." The girl in front of him with black hair called back, "Yes, ma'am? Please take care of Yagi until he's caught up with the rest of us." The teacher directed. Yayorozu looked back at him, then nodded with rather intense determination. With that, his first day of class began. When lunch break began, Izuku was about ready to call it a day. Yayorozu had been extremely helpful, and while quite straightforward, she was polite. always making sure that he was on the same page as the rest of the class. Now that break was upon them, he was excited to ask her a few questions about herself and maybe try and befriend her. Though he was a bit nervous, he knew she'd been assigned to help him and she'd been very considerate the entire day, so part of him hoped she wouldn't abandon him for any friends she had during break. So when the class was lining up to be let out, he raced to put away his things so that he wouldn't be too far away from her in line. "Are you okay? You're packing awfully fast just to go to lunch." Izuku looked up slightly embarrassed to find Yaoyorozu staring down at him from her place beside his desk. She was a lot taller than he thought she'd be now that she was standing, almost a whole head taller than himself, and her hair fell just past her shoulders. He began to stutter, then stopped to gather his thoughts. "Always know what you're going to say," his father always said. "I just didn't want to lose you in line. You're kind of the only person I know." He chuckled a bit and relaxed when her serious expression gave way to something just the slightest bit softer. "It's fine, it's my job to make sure you're keeping up with the rest of us." With a nod and a smile, Izuku finished putting up his supplies and followed Yaoyorozu into their class line. Without too much preamble, their teacher led them to the cafeteria. "If you have any allergies, you need to tell the lunch lady that's serving, okay?" Yaoyorozu informed him. "It'd be bad if there was an accident." "No, I don't have any allergies that I know of," Izuku replied. His gaze was focused on the cafeteria. It was far nicer than the one at his old school. "So," he began after they had retrieved their meals and been seated at their class table, "what do you do for fun?" Before Yaoyorozu could respond, he started up again and began fiddling with his rice. "I mean, you don't have to answer, I'm just Dash." He cut himself off as he looked up from the rice he'd been fidgeting with and caught the bemused expression on his guide's face. "Just being friendly," the boy finished lamely and sighed. "I'm sorry." "It's okay," Yaoyorozu smiled. "You're new." She looked thoughtful, then continued, "When I'm not studying for school, I mostly just read books on how things are put together and how they work." "Oh." Izuku smiled. "Do you want to be hero support?" "Oh no, I want to be a hero." The girl explained, "My quirk is creation, and I can only make something if I know what it's made of." "That's really useful." Izuku relaxed and felt a bit more comfortable than before. Until now their interactions were limited to the work assignments, so if she was willing to talk about other things, maybe they could be friends like he'd hoped. "So what's your quirk?" All the hope and relief that had just gathered fell through to the pit of Izuku's stomach at the question. Of course she'd ask about it. She'd just explained hers, and it would be the easiest conversation to have for new friends. "Let's talk all about our cool quirks and what fun things we use them for." Izuku sighed internally. He was such an idiot. "Actually," he began, "he'd went through training with Grandpa for this. Even before this, he'd been hiding parts of his life since he was born. But it still kind of hurt, because he knew what would happen. She'd just think he was a weirdo and ignore him until the end of time." Pushing forward, he answered her, "I'm not really allowed to talk about that." He received a confused, "Huh?" for his efforts. "My parents don't want me talking about it." Izuku clarified the best he could, and it was like a light went off in her eye. He sighed, thinking he knew what was coming, but instead she beamed at him excitedly. Leaning forward, she whispered, "Your parents are pro-heroes, aren't they? And your quirk is too similar to them, so you have to hide it, right?" Izuku leaned back suddenly and Yaoyorozu collected herself. "They must be pretty big for you to have to hide it." "But I understand." It was his turn to be confused and she gave him a smirk. "My family are heroes too." His smile in response would give his father's a run for its money. "No one in this class is from a hero family except me. But no one really talks to me because I'm always studying, and most of the boys don't like that I'm taller than them." Yaoyorozu shared. It was like a door had been opened. While she was still rather serious, she was a lot more relaxed. Izuku nodded emphatically. "At my old school, I didn't have any friends either. It's kind of hard. No one really gets having heroes for parents. They think it's all so cool, but it's scary sometimes, especially when they get hurt." She frowned. That was something Izuku had never really experienced until now, and that wound was still so fresh. The air in his lungs felt almost solid as he choked out a meek, "Yeah," and did his best not to cry. Inhaling, doing his best to collect himself, Izuku plowed forward. I know what you mean. Yaoyorozu nodded. On the news everyone is cheering and you cheer for them too. But you're scared for them too. Izuku replied, remembering when he was especially small and barely reconciling the idea of his father being the same man on TV with the smile and the super strength. It's weird sometimes to think of that person on TV as the person who makes you soup when you're sick, that I can't really explain it. They're heroes. But they're like your dad. Yaoyorozu tried then frowned, causing Izuku to sputter a laugh. Her face was straight again before she gave a response. You're right, it's hard to explain. The two sat silently thinking it over for a moment before Izuku remembered that Yaoyorozu had asked what his quirk was. I can't answer your question, but... Izuku smiled hopefully. If Yaoyorozu was someone who appreciated studying and finding out how things were made, would she appreciate what was basically a manual on what makes a hero? It was a risk, but I can show you my hero analysis notebooks. Being a hero isn't just about having a good quirk. So I've been taking battle notes on all the fights I see and making profiles for all the best heroes. The look on her face was worth it. That's smart. You can learn how to fight villains without actually fighting them, she smirked. You said notebooks? How many? Only 2 right now. But I plan on a lot more. He confessed. She nodded seriously in understanding. There are a lot of great heroes, and some will debut before you have the chance to enter a hero course. Yaoyorozu looked thoughtful and then nodded as if deciding something. Maybe if you show me them I can give you notes on my parents. Sure. Izuku chuckled, a bit delirious with joy. A week. That's how much longer Recovery Girl said he'd have to stay in the hospital before he'd be within her ability to care for. He'd been sleeping mostly. Toshinori was sort of surprised how tired he was all the time given that he was always in bed, but then he'd remember Recovery Girl scolding him and telling him that healing took energy too. As for the present, he wondered what Izuku was doing on his very first day in a new school. His son was resilient, but he'd been pushed pretty far recently. He hoped he'd at least make one friend. Thoughts drifted towards Inko and he sighed. She was taking the day to rest, probably treating herself to a day at the spa or even just sleeping. She deserved it. The hero's thoughts were cut short though by the sound of his hospital room door opening. Toshinori turned his head to see who it was and sighed deeply, feeling exhausted all over again. Sir Night Eye looked as impeccable and grim as ever. The look of determination on his face spoke of the impending argument they were about to have. Toshinori sighed and let it come. As usual, Night Eye greeted him pleasantly with a, "How are you faring, All Might?" and they carried on pleasant enough until... Have you made a decision then? Will you be training him to take your place so you can retire? Toshinori clenched his fist. He was so tired of it all. He wanted to sleep again suddenly but knew the problem wouldn't go away if he did. He's my son, Night Eye. I can't just make arbitrary decisions. I have to talk to Inko. I have to talk to him. He deserves a choice in this. Besides, Gran Torino has a point. Izuku is still very young and he may not want to be a hero later. He may not be cut out to be a hero later. That's nonsense. The outburst was sudden and the sidekick stooped up from the chair by Toshinori's bed and evened his breathing before he continued. Izuku is intelligent and creative with a very analytical mind. On top of that, he's your son and has a very good heart. Every other essential thing can be trained into him. He's young, so it won't be too difficult. The boy only lacks confidence and skill. Retire now. Devote yourself to him. Enough. Toshinori roared, letting out all his frustration in one word. I know all of this. I want to choose him, but there are so many things to consider, Night Eye, beyond what you're saying. So please let's not talk about this anymore until I'm home and I can actually make a decision. Please, even if I do choose him, I might not retire until he receives his hero license, so your argument is pointless. Sir Night Eye closed his eyes and nodded firmly. I understand, sir. Just please consider what I've said. It's not just important to your health but the future of society. I know. Toshinori sighed and closed his eyes. If you have nothing else to tell me, leave. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Night Eye stood by his bed for a PRD of time, contemplating his choices before he sat down again. I've been searching for another sidekick for the agency. I can't run it on brains alone. Do you have any suggestions? Heaving a sigh, the hero nodded, glad for the temporary reprieve from the previous conversation, and they discussed potential hires for Sir Night Eye to work with. Happily chatting together as they waited at the pickup area with the rest of their class, Izuku found that while his new friend Yaoyorozu tended to take everything completely seriously, she still enjoyed a good joke, but preferred a good book. She seemed to only light up and become passionate when she talked about building things and how they worked. They were talking about how she'd learned to create Russian nesting dolls and how she was trying to pop them out containing another creation when they were approached by a small group of kids from their class. Leading them was a rather plump girl with bright blue hair and dark skin. "Hi, I'm Ando." She smiled a bit nervously and looked to her group of about 5 friends before turning back to him and Yaoyorozu. "So you didn't introduce yourself properly. The rest of us were wondering what your quirk was, so you can maybe play with us later." Ando kept glancing back at her friends, who seemed to nod encouragingly at her and shoot her thumbs up. Having been used to motives more sinister, Izuku mustered as friendly a smile as he could, a part of him relieved but another part knowing he wasn't quite out of the woods yet. "I'm not allowed to talk about it, sorry. But I shouldn't need to use a quirk to play with you guys, right?" The girl seemed to deflate and sighed deeply. "Playing without quirks is boring." She then seemed to notice Yaoyorozu, then smirked. "I guess you could come too. I mean, as long as he shows us his quirk." "I'm not allowed to use my quirk, but Yaoyorozu can play if she wants." He turned to his new friend, who shook her head and seemed a bit too uninterested in the entire exchange. "I'm fine, I have to study." Izuku wondered if she was a bit upset that their conversation had been interrupted. Not many kids their age would want to talk about how Russian nesting dolls and gearboxes were made. Then again, he'd always been a bit too odd for his peers. "But come on, that's stupid. My quirk is paper. I can control small bits of paper. My friends all have cool quirks too, but it's okay if yours isn't especially cool." Ando encouraged and looked at him expectantly. "Just cause the teacher said she had to help you doesn't mean you have to stay with boring old Yaoyorozu. I'll even help you tomorrow, just come play with us." "I already told you I'm not allowed," Izuku reaffirmed. He was starting to get frustrated with her. "If that's all you wanted, then I'm just gonna." He trailed off and leaned towards Yaoyorozu. The two of them prepared to walk away. Knowing how quickly this kind of exchange could turn bad, he had no idea who these girls were or what they would do. Izuku wanted to get out as quickly as he could. "Whatever," the girl huffed, turning back to her friends. "You're probably as boring as she is anyways." As the group left and he and Yaoyorozu made their way further from them, Izuku felt nothing but relief at how ridiculously well that had gone and heaved an enormous sigh. Yaoyorozu shook her head. "Ignore them, they shouldn't bother you too much, they're not mean, they're just used to doing what they want." Izuku nodded, thinking immediately of Kachin. Do they have really impressive quirks or something? I mean, that paper thing seems really useful. He then noticed that his new friend was looking at him as if he'd grown another head. Suddenly he felt out of his depth. Luckily Yaoyorozu was up for explaining. Not really, but her dad is a minister, so she's treated really nicely by all the teachers. Izuku nodded a bit. He understood kind of, but it was such a foreign concept it would take a while for him to get used to. "Do you think they'll keep asking about my quirk?" "They'll probably ask the teachers, but if they don't say anything they'll probably think you're quirkless." Yaoyorozu frowned, which is pretty rude if you think about it. The fact that Yaoyorozu thought Ando would think he was quirkless was far too close to the truth for Izuku's comfort, so he changed the subject back to her quirk. That was safe. She seemed eager to talk all about the things she was learning to make. And for now that was fine. The week flew by for Izuku, and before he knew it his papa was being moved by a combined effort of the hospital and the UA back into their home. It took a day, and after it was over his schedule only changed to make room for his father. He'd started doing his homework in his parents' room when his papa was up for the company. The two of them would occasionally watch the news together, and Izuku would sometimes sit at the foot of the bed and just tell him all about the day he had at school with Yaoyorozu. Toshinori being home had the added benefit of the invisible tension that had hovered over all of them to relax. His mama and papa kept reminding him that papa would have to go back in for a few more surgeries once he had recovered enough from the last few, but Izuku was just happy to have the time they did now. As Izuku and Yaoyorozu grew more friendly, he decided to be prepared and asked his papa, Mama, and Grandpa if she'd be able to visit. They took almost no time to approve of her, saying that her parents were actually some of the heroes covering for All Might's sick leave. So with life rolling forward once again, and one morning he found himself on the playground waiting for classes to begin, Yaoyorozu came walking up to him far more briskly than he'd ever seen her before. She'd sat down in front of him and leaned forward much like she had that first day at mealtime and whispered, "I told my dad about you and he said you're All Might's son." Before he could even try to form a response because his brain had hiccuped, she continued, "I just want you to know that I know. I don't want you to think I became your friend because of your dad or that I was hiding that I knew." When Izuku's brain caught up to her words and he caught her grim and determined expression, he just began to laugh hysterically. "Of course it's fine," he replied once he'd gained a bit of control back. "I'm not laughing at you, Yaoyorozu. I forgot. I asked if I could tell you, then I just forgot." Once again he was laughing, but her face had changed to a more long-suffering expression. But he just kept giggling like a fool because really, she was stuck with him at this point. "Are you allowed to visit friends?" Yaoyorozu asked one day during their meal break. There was the normal chatter and they had just finished their servings and making their way to a patch of grass they had claimed as their own in the schoolyard. "I think so," Izuku replied, a bit startled at the phrasing. It wasn't as if he was a prisoner. His mother and father were just really careful about everything. To him it made sense considering his papa's condition. Yaoyorozu nodded and adjusted her position. "I'm only asking because my parents want to meet you and want to invite you over for dinner, but I don't know what your parents would say." "Oh, of course." He enthused. It had been ages since he was invited to anyone's home. "I've just got to tell my mama and papa, but I'm pretty sure they'll say yes." Izuku beamed at his new friend in open excitement. "At my old school no one but Kachin played with me, but that was only because we were neighbors and then everyone had quirks and—" He sighed, trailing off. He couldn't tell her, not yet. Someday he hoped he could. Yaoyorozu was really nice and he'd hoped they could become the best of friends in time. "Ah," she nodded, seeming to fill in the gap he's left with whatever her own brain came up with. "You couldn't talk about yours, so everyone thought you were quirkless like Ando and her friends." Izuku blinked at her. With what she knew that made perfect sense, and it was pretty amazing she'd think that up. He couldn't agree with her because he couldn't lie, so he just shrugged. "So, this Kachin," she began again, "is he still friends with you?" "Oh, not really." Izuku frowned and looked at his hand that rested on his knee. "Some things happened and well, I promised Papa I'd stay away from him after a bad day at school." Her silence told him she was filling the gaps with what she already knew, which wasn't a lot, but Yaoyorozu was smart. Like really smart, so he knew she'd figure out at least part of it. Instead of continuing to let the pressure build in his chest at the reminder of his falling out with Kachin when they were a mere 4, Izuku began playing with his bracelet. Thinking of the other boy made him ache, but the cool metal of his bracelet calmed him enough that he could look back up at Yaoyorozu. The sight of her grounded him right here in the present. "But you have to have other friends, right?" Izuku smiled, trying his best to move on from any further thoughts of Katsuki Bakugo. Yaoyorozu pursed her lips a bit. "No. Most people run when they see all the books I carry. That's okay though, if they don't like learning I won't like them." Izuku coughed, trying to cover up the laugh that had bubbled up from the stone response. "That's probably why Mom and Dad want to meet you," she mused. "I just want to see if you actually kept all those Russian dolls." Izuku joked after regaining his ability to speak. The remark earned a frown from her. "My mom is weird, I don't get why she keeps those things. Some of them look like they're cursed." Which caused him to have to choke back another guffaw. "My papa is like that too. I think he still has all the artwork I made in preschool in a box in his office." Yaoyorozu shook her head and sighed, and they too began trying to prove that they had the most embarrassing parent. Inko's only consolation within the entire situation that she had found her family in was that she didn't actually have to work. The job she had maintained previously was not necessary for income, but she'd pursued it so that she wouldn't feel idle. She wasn't feeling very idle now. Not with her husband laid up in their room needing near constant care. Inko had felt a bit bad at the relief that had washed over her when Izuku had finally started school, but between maintaining the house and taking care of Toshinori now that he was home, she was swamped. Part of her missed the other mothers of the neighborhood, the simplicity of bonding over their children's antics. Of course her relationship with the other mothers had been strained over the years, but they were still someone to talk to. As she hung laundry or did her shopping, they had sort of made a point of being scarce around the neighbors when they visited Toshi in the summers and on holidays. She didn't know anyone here and it was starting to get her a bit anxious. Her husband was good company when he was awake, and he was her best friend. He'd have to be. Living apart was no easy task. Inko hadn't felt like this since Recovery Girl had told them Izuku was quirkless. She kept forgetting her husband was here, close enough to touch. She didn't have to wait until 6 p.m. to call him on the phone and tell him about her day. He was here now and hopefully it would be this way until the very end. On top of all the stress, that was at least slowly but surely receding, Toshi was acting a bit jumpy around her, as if she hadn't noticed that Gran Torino seemed a bit disgruntled every time he left and that Night Eye seemed keen on avoiding her and Izuku. All Might's sidekicks seemed to be visiting on days she'd have to go to the market and at times when Izuku was at school. She had only known he'd been over because Toshi had told her or he'd left only after she'd returned home. The man liked Izuku and sometimes stayed over actively seeking the boy's attention, so it was all very strange, but she figured it had to do with Toshi's future as All Might. Inko kept assuring herself that her foolish husband would tell her when he was ready. They were a team. Heaving a sigh, Inko folded clothing and spared a glance at the clock that was up in the doorway of their laundry room. She'd been at it for an hour and it was almost time to wake her husband for a small meal. Finishing her task that was directly at hand, Inko lifted her arms in a light stretch before heading into the kitchen to warm up a bowl of soup for him. She had been given a small booklet of recipes that Toshi could handle by Recovery Girl, and would made a decent-sized pot of soup so that she'd only have to warm portions for her husband for 2 or 3 days at a time. Inko spooned the soup into a small pot that was big enough to heat 2 servings. As it heated, she prepared a sandwich for herself. Nothing fancy, just something to fill her up. Taking out 2 bowls and 1 plate, for her sandwich, she served the soup as evenly as she could. Placing all of the food on a tray she had bought just for this, she carried it over to the bedroom her and Toshi shared. Setting her burden down on the end table next to the bed, she looked at the peaceful face of her husband. He'd already begun losing weight. It's been more than a month and he wasn't gaunt by any means. If he hadn't been laid up in bed, Toshinori would seem healthy as a horse. Making her way over to him, she began her routine of singing a small tune. He was a big man who'd been through a lot. Her voice would ensure that he wouldn't be shocked by her wake-up call. By the time Inko reached his side, he was showing signs of being pulled from rest. Lightly she touched his hand. "Toshi, it's me. It's time to eat," she called as gently as she could while still trying to wake him up. Stirring lightly, a sigh came from his lips, and she smiled softly at him before speaking again. "Toshi, your soup is going to get cold again." A small whine escaped him as his brow furrowed, eyes still closed, but the smile that was spreading across his face gave him away. "I don't want to wake up. You should join me. It's nice in this bed." As nice as that sounds, I have to pick up Izuku in a few hours, and I don't think I could if I fell asleep now. She smiled and began to grab the tray on his bedside. Finally, Toshinori began carefully positioning himself into a sitting position, being as delicate as he could with his wounds, but not before sighing dramatically while beaming as brightly as only a man who was besotted with his wife could. Inko smiled back and brought the tray to him and popped the collapsible legs out from under it and placed it over her husband's lap. Snatching her plated sandwich and bowl, she sat in a soft chair that was set up next to him and placed her food on the nightstand. It was a routine they had going for only a couple weeks, but to them it was a semblance of sanity in the chaos that had become their lives. They ate and began talking about everything and nothing, and sometimes sat in a comfortable silence as they ate, settling into the familiar atmosphere that settled around them as they came together for something so simple as a meal. Inko sighed. When they finished eating, Toshinori tangled their hands together almost silently, and they simply sat in a moment of stillness, enjoying the atmosphere they had built together. Life wasn't perfect, but it was getting better. Inko was getting worried, and Toshinori had a pretty good idea why. It's not that he was keeping secrets from his beloved wife, but with everything happening, he didn't want to put even more things on her plate to stress about. He'd resolved to tell her today. Gran Torino had come again when Inko left to pick up Izuku, spouting this and that about how Izuku was too young to choose. Toshinori thought otherwise. Mostly. His mentor had left before Inko had returned with an excited Izuku asking if he could go to the Yaoyorozu's house on Saturday. Izuku was practically bouncing around the bedroom in excitement at having made a proper friend. Toshinori felt a bit bad, but silently he fumed at that Bakuga boy for the way he had treated Izuku and Bakuga's parents for letting him act that way, along with the rest of the world who treated quirks as the way to measure a human's worth. His son had been so ecstatic, not about making a friend in a new place, but making his first friend since preschool. They'd told him they'd talk it over, but he'd probably be able to go, and Izuku had exploded into a mess of tears. Toshinori just held his boy as he'd cried his thanks. Before he knew it, the day was over and he still had a conversation to hold with his wife. Inko took them through their nightly routine, that is to say, she finished hers then promptly began helping Toshinori with his. All the while the supposedly number one here was having a hard time trying to figure out how to even broach the subject of one for all. So he just went with simple, if jarring. I think we should start training Izuku so that when he's older he can inherit one for all. Inko, as he expected she would, froze. Her hands poised over one of the buttons on his nightshirt that she had been in the process of doing up. Her voice was soft but very firm. He's 9. He wants to be a hero. Continued, I'll give him the choice when he's older, but right now Izuku wants to be a hero and he's going to need to train for that regardless. It really wouldn't be a conversation of if, but when it came to the subject of Izuku's training. They had both known it from the moment Izuku had seen a video of All Might on TV and declared he was going to be a hero. Izuku was like Inko in that way. Once he put his mind to something he wouldn't falter. The notebooks was a natural step too. They'd had such a rough time finding out Izuku was quirkless. Nevertheless, the precious boy had declared he would continue on by learning from other heroes. So Toshinori knew this conversation had always been coming. Inko inhaled and looked him in the eye with the steel of a truly powerful soul. Can't you wait a little longer? He's so young and I don't want him thinking he has to become a hero because of a dream he had when he was only 5. Inko would have been crying if she wasn't so determined. Right now is the best time. Toshinori sighed. It's actually a bit late to be honest. Most heroes' children start training at about if he wants to get into a good hero course, quirk or no quirk, he's going to need at least 5 years to get himself strong enough to stand toe-to-toe with all the other children who were born with quirks. He could see the cogs turning in her mind and before he knew it, a few small tears were rolling down her face. Inko leaned forward gently and pressed herself into her husband's chest, letting his sleepwear soak up her tears. He was already much smaller than just a few months ago and the short walks that he and an Inko would go on around their backyard was enough to keep healthy but not nearly enough to keep his muscle mass. Yet his wife was still dwarfed by his size. Please ask him first. I want him to have a choice. Inko softly. This isn't what she'd wanted. He was still coming around to the idea himself. I'll ask him, darling, he'll have a choice every step of the way. He reassured her, pressing the side of his face into her hair as her small form shook. Suddenly Inko pulled away, a look of bitter determination on her face. Train him, Toshi, but only when you think his body is ready enough that he won't get hurt too badly, then you make it his choice about one for all. Promise me. He did the only thing he could in the face of such a dignified and logical request from his wife and said, I promise. Of course, training Izuku personally was out of the question. Gran Torino told him that he could stuff it if Toshinori thought that he could get him to do it. Toshinori then told him that he'd have to be trained regardless if he was to inherit or not, and his mentor kind of just crumpled and nodded before getting the scariest expression on his face Toshinori had ever beheld. The hero prayed his mentor would remember his son still had a few years to grow. As for Sir Nightai, the sidekick-turned-hero declared he would help the best he could and even give efficiency training once Izuku was up to it. In Toshinori's opinion, Night-Eye was a bit too enthusiastic. The two of them hadn't really been talking. Night-Eye seemed very upset with his decision not to retire but also approved of his decision to train Izuku as his successor. So they existed in this strange limbo of, I'm going to help your son but send Inko if you have something to say. Of course Night-Eye was also determined to help Izuku with his self-esteem. All Might Psychic knew how beautiful the boy could smile and how he could capture a room. But that was only around people he knew well. So he'd made it his mission to see the boy bloom. Self-defense was a good first step. For the small tight-knit family, it was the beginning of a new age. The sound of the TV filled the bedroom. The newscaster spoke about a villain attack several districts away from where his father now sat in his bed. Izuku lay next to him, the boy's feet at the hero's waist, arms folded as a makeshift pillow for his head that was next to his father's knees. A small pile of homework consisting of 2 sheets of paper and a book lay semi-forgotten as Izuku had abandoned them for better pastimes. He was debating with himself if he should leave and get his notebook, or stay and not miss anything. Either way, it's getting written down, that's something he's sure of. His father is rather silent, but they can both hear his mom in the other room listening to the radio and cleaning the dishes that had been used during dinner. Izuku is starting to get used to this. His mom will come in soon and help him with his schoolwork. The 3 of them will watch Night Watch, the short program that highlights heroes of the night, and then he'd be sent off to bed. The beginning of a routine is helping him, he thinks. The silence, but not the comfort, is broken by his father, who up till now had been unusually quiet. Izuku, son, what do you think being a hero means? The question wasn't really new, but here and now, being in Tokyo with his father permanently, it seemed a bit different. Izuku thought it over for a moment to collect his thoughts on it, thinks about his father and everything he stands for, and he smiles. Being a hero means saving people with a smile, 'cause they're scared, and it's right. The boy's reply is enthusiastic, getting up and turning to face his father while standing on his knees. His father is smiling right back. There was a warm feeling bubbling up inside of Izuku as he tossed himself next to his father, landing directly parallel to him. Small arms attempting and utterly failing to wrap around the massive man. The hero laughed as he let his son begin burrowing into his side. Izuku got comfortable, then whispered, "Being a hero means being just like you, Papa." Izuku, remember when you asked me if you could be a hero too? The question is careful and soft. Izuku nods and looks up to his father's face and sees nothing but honest interest. Do you think you wanted to start training to be a hero? A rush of excitement overtakes him as he presses even further to his father's side and squeals in pure joy. Yes. When? Izuku chanted excitedly until he stopped to think again. His father was due for more surgery soon, so his training couldn't be any time in the near future. But his papa just grinned. Gran Torino is going to start showing you simple workouts and self-defense tomorrow. Which just caused another outburst of excitement. Izuku's mind kept chanting over and over again, "I'm going to be a hero." But no one ever said being a hero was easy. This was something Izuku found out the hard way. As he was still rather small, training couldn't be too rough, but he'd never been particularly athletic to begin with, so he was partly worried. It was a normal day. He went to school with Yaoyorozu and took the train home with his mama. Except when he got home, he didn't eat a snack. Entering the house, he found himself immediately set upon by Gran Torino. It was more of an excessive hug than tackle, but it was an assault from the left side and it left Izuku off balance. Before he could crash to the floor, the retired hero got a firm hold on him and pulled the boy back up. Lesson 1. Be alert. Anything can happen anywhere, the man chirped, and Inko, who had entered just after Izuku and had screeched in surprise, now wore a rather angry expression. Save all the training for the dojo. She frowned. You almost gave me a heart attack. Grandpa, now looking rather nervous, nodded, then promptly dragged the boy to the dojo. The dojo was a room that had always been off limits to Izuku. It was a room filled with workout and weight training equipment. Entering it for the first time felt like entering a whole new world. Half of the rather large room was full of equipment and machines, and the other half had what seemed to be large mats spread across the floor. Right now you're really young, so we won't be using the equipment. Gran Torino began. You'll be doing all your exercises on the mats. Until you're old enough, you're not allowed to touch the machines, is that clear? Yes, sir. Izuku nodded firmly, silently making it his goal to use the machines as soon as he could. The excitement that had been slowly buzzing beneath the surface of his skin since he entered the room was starting to build and cause him to shake. His grandpa started him out with basic stretches and a couple of laps around the matted area. Izuku was rather exhausted by the time he did a cool-down. "We really need to work on your stamina." Grandpa smiled looking at his clipboard. "Well, we have time, so we'll just have to work up from here." The retired hero reached out and ruffled the boy's head. "You did pretty good for a squirt though." "Really?" Izuku beamed at him as brightly as he could, being as exhausted as he was. They were lucky. That was the first thought Gran Torino had when he started Izuku on his rather basic exercises. They were lucky that they'd had the foresight to start training him now. Izuku was determined to be a hero. The boy didn't even know about One for All, and he was still determined to be a hero. He was likely to get himself in big trouble if they didn't start now. Izuku was the kind of kid to think things through, so much so he'd probably neglect training his body altogether if there wasn't anyone there to tell him that he'd have to. So Izuku was really lucky too, he supposed. Well, they had a lot of time. By his reckoning, Izuku would be in shape enough to meet Inko's qualifications when he was about 14, 15 if they wanted to play it extra safe. But 15 was still cutting it pretty close. They would barely have enough time to get Izuku into fighting form with One for All. Because no doubt Toshinori would want to send him to UA. Gran Torino could practically see the boy's future laid out for him. It wouldn't do to add unneeded pressure to his shoulders. So they'd play it by ear and really have to roll with the punches, he supposed. Still, they were pushing it. Especially with Toshinori's current condition. He'd rather push the envelope than break Izuku. He'd always choose Izuku. The course they were walking was a rather precarious one. Training a boy from so young to inherit One for All hadn't been done before. But in the end it would be Izuku's choice. He'd never have agreed to this if Inko and Toshinori hadn't made that clear, and Izuku didn't want to be a hero so badly. The one good thing about this situation was if anyone asked, Izuku could just say he got his quirk from his dad. It would be a more literal truth, but they wouldn't have to deal with a random teen unrelated to All Might having an eerily similar quirk. Especially when the man had a wife and child that were probably going to be in the media on occasion. Gran Torino decided that while they were rather lucky, they were still pretty screwed for time. Saturday after school was also a rather different affair than Izuku's regular routine. This time it was only a temporary change, but it wasn't any less exciting. When the bell rang, Yaoyorozu turned back in her seat and smiled at him, which Izuku returned brightly. He'd be visiting a friend's house, not just any friend, a friend who knew about his father and had hero parents. Izuku sat with her at the waiting area and showed her the notes he took on a rookie hero that made it onto Night Watch the evening before. They were still discussing her when Mr. Yaoyorozu came to gather them. He introduced himself rather quickly and said, "Thank you for being Momo's friend." Yaoyorozu blushed, and they were off to the train station. Equipped with his address and home phone in his notebook, Izuku trudged after Mr. Yaoyorozu, all the while grinning at his friend excitedly. The same wild energy he got when he would start training with his grandpa was filling up his veins. The trio rode the train into the Yaoyorozu's neighborhood, and Izuku's classmate excitedly told him about the gardens they kept. When the train stopped, they unloaded, and Mr. Yaoyorozu guided them out of the station and to the house. Walking down the street, he just watched as the two of them chatted happily about heroes and quirks and catapults, which Yaoyorozu had just started learning to make the components for. Reaching the house, Izuku noted it was rather traditional and modern all at once. Mr. Yaoyorozu spoke up, disrupting the chatter that had been going for some time between the two children. "I'll call you both for dinner. Your mom should be home before then, Momo. Now you know you'll have to wait for her to show him the gardens." Yaoyorozu nodded. "Yes, Daddy." She trailed off, considering something, then asked, "Can I show Izuku the training room?" Mr. Yaoyorozu hemmed and hawed a bit, then replied, "Sure, but don't touch the equipment, okay?" "Yes, Daddy." She smiled, then grabbed Izuku by the hand and dragged him off. "I'm gonna show you my room first so you can see the things I've made. Then I'll show you the training room. I'm only allowed to make stuff in there right now so I can show you my quirk." Izuku followed willingly. He didn't really want to get lost, and he'd be lying if he said those things didn't sound really cool. "We have a room for training too, but we call it the dojo," Izuku replied. "It's really cool, so I can't wait to see yours." Yaoyorozu beamed brightly at him before stopping in front of sliding door and pushing it open. Motioning for Izuku to follow, she went in and headed straight for a chest at the foot of her bed. I keep all my failed stuff I haven't got right yet in here so I can look at them to see what I did wrong. Izuku watched her open the chest. It was full of gearboxes and other mechanisms. He even spotted a mini catapult. That's so cool! He enthused. Yaoyorozu began pulling things out and showing him bits and pieces, explaining where she went wrong and how she thought she could best fix it. Izuku listened enthralled. Her quirk was so extensive. He had known that, but actually seeing it laid out, it was really humbling. Yaoyorozu pulled out the catapult and pointed to the hinge. I keep making the pin too weak and it kind of breaks, so I need to find out how to make it a different metal. That's cool. But why don't you just make it thicker? Izuku frowned thoughtfully. For the size of the catapult, if I made the pin thicker, I'd have to make the hinge bigger. A bigger hinge would be awkward on a small catapult. And you'd have to make the catapult bigger, then you're back to the pin being too weak of a metal. That's really interesting. Izuku smiled. Yaoyorozu nodded but added, if I made it right, a bigger hinge would be fine on a small catapult, but I'd like to be able to make stronger stuff that have to resort to bigger, since if it's smaller it takes a shorter amount of time to make. Izuku nodded. You want to be faster, that's really smart. After going over several of Yaoyorozu's projects, she took him to the training room, which had different equipment and less strength training equipment. She offered to show him some basic moves her mom had taught her, and Izuku wasn't going to say no to that. After a light workout showing each other things they had learned from their lessons, a thought struck him. Yaoyorozu was his best friend. Kacchan had grown up with him, but he'd been rather distant and gruff with him longer than they had actually ever been friends. Yaoyorozu, on the other hand, had been nice from the beginning, and nothing had changed when she found out his father was All Might. She hadn't asked why his father wasn't working. She had to know, her parents were working extra and All Might wasn't in the news at all. She wanted to be his friend because of him. You know, you should call me Izuku, he stuttered out, staring at the spot just above her shoulder. He couldn't look at her and he could feel himself blushing. Yaoyorozu was silent and he immediately regretted saying anything. They'd only been friends for a couple weeks. That was way too soon to start. Only if you call me Momo. It's a fair trade. Finally he met her eyes and she was blushing just as much as he was. Momo made him a doll and let him take it home. It was green and black and Izuku thought it was perfect. The next day at training he showed his grandpa what Momo had taught him. Grandpa smiled and nodded. She seems pretty advanced. She's probably been training for a while. 'Cause she has a really good quirk. Izuku enthused. She'll be a really cool hero. That made his grandpa smile, a smile Izuku had never seen before, but it was bright and warm and it made Izuku want to keep it there. She's good for you. The retired hero announced, maybe when you've got a bit more training we can set up a training session with the two of you. That made Izuku's day even brighter. Yes, sir. I'll do my best to catch up. Izuku promised happily, another goal to be attained. Life kept going. Izuku went to school and trained with Grandpa and he had forgotten. No, not forgotten, he'd ignored it. But today was the day Papa was well enough to go back to the hospital and finish up with hopefully the last of his surgeries. Izuku woke up extra early as he heard the voices of his family members and their soft footfalls. Shooting out of bed, he rushed to the living room to find his Papa and Uncle Tsukwachi with Grandpa and Mama dressed up in their coats and travel cloths. The surprising part was his Uncle Night Eye, who he hadn't seen in forever, was sitting at the dining table with a stack of what seemed to be paperwork. His mother caught sight of him first. Izuku! She called out in surprise but immediately softened. What are you doing up so early, honey? As for Izuku, he just yawned and wiped his eyes before replying in earnest. I just wanted to say good luck to Papa one more time. I was worried because I won't see him for a while. Gran Torino chuckled and Izuku's father smiled so brightly, a smile he gave just to him and his family. Thank you, Izuku, I'm so happy to hear it one more time. But you should go back to sleep, okay? You need to rest up for the day. Izuku nodded but ran over to his father and wrapped his arms around his legs as much as he could. I love you, Papa. Get better soon, okay? Tashinori coughed in mild surprise but placed a hand on Izuku's head, ruffling it. I'll do my best, Izuku. Izuku let his father free, and after a brief goodbye from all the adults, save for Night Eye, his father was off for his next round of treatments and Izuku hoped they'd be over soon. When they were all gone, Night Eye promptly tucked the boy back in for bed with promises of breakfast in a few hours. When Izuku woke up again, it was to the smell of tamagoyaki, miso soup and fish. This time he got up slowly and had begun changing into his clothing for the day. Particularly an all-might shirt. He didn't care if it seemed silly, he wanted to feel close to his father right now. Sparing a glance to his uniform, the boy made his way down the hall to the living room and crossed to the kitchen. He wouldn't be going to school today. As he entered the kitchen, he noticed that his uncle was making miso udon, which was an odd choice for breakfast, but there was no rice, so he figured it would be their replacement. Quickly thinking of a joke to surprise him, Izuku smiled widely and got his attention. "Uncle." Night Eye turned to face him with a greeting on his tongue, but Izuku continued before he could. Izuku, with a perfectly serene smile on his face, asked, "Is that real udon or an impasta?" For a moment nothing happened and Izuku feared his attempt to make his uncle laugh, as he'd striven to do whenever he had the chance, had fallen unceremoniously flat. But then Night Eye began to lightly chuckle while shook his head. "Will you set the table? Food is almost done." Proud of himself for earning a chuckle, Izuku began grabbing everything they would need for their meal, including plate, bowls, and any utensils. He hummed a small tune that had gotten in his head at some point while listening to the radio. Night Eye began pouring his soup and Izuku served himself a bit of the egg his uncle had made him. "You're rather chipper this morning." Izuku, who had begun eating his egg, stopped and looked at his uncle, who did not seem expectant, just concerned and maybe a bit curious. "Papa is having surgery again, and that means he's doing his best to be closer to being better." Night Eye smiled so softly at him. "It's going to be a while again before he's well enough to do a lot of things, but you're right, he's doing his best, and so should we." "Is that how you really feel? You're not just saying that, right?" "What? No." Izuku panicked, so suddenly he threw his piece of tamagoyaki, slapping his uncle in the face with egg, but his mind was elsewhere. Night Eye cleaned up the egg swiftly. "Don't worry, Izuku, you haven't done anything wrong. I just get worried about you. If that's how you really feel, then we should do our best too, right?" Izuku nodded and looked down at his soup. The last time his papa was in the hospital, he'd had a spectacular meltdown with his grandpa. It wasn't the worst one he'd ever had. That was reserved for the one after he'd found out he was quirkless. Papa has been really sick and I know it's not gonna get better for a while. I just don't want to worry Mama and Papa more than they already are." The sidekick nodded. "While I understand why you'd feel that way, I don't think you have it quite right." Izuku looked up again to see Night Eye smirking like he had a secret. To be together as a big family, it means worrying each other all the time, even if there's nothing to actually worry about. "But I thought you and Papa said heroes are supposed to always smile." The boy frowned. Night Eye shook his head. "You're still not quite a hero yet, and besides, that only goes for when you are being strong for the citizens in need. You should always be willing to share your fears with your family because they're the ones who protect you." Izuku popped a piece of egg in his mouth and sipped his soup in thought, then his uncle smiled and added, "Just like you did this morning." The boy stared at his uncle and he could feel tears forming in his eyes. "I'll do my best." Night Eye nodded. "Now eat up. We're going to go shopping to get you clothes for when you train, and after that I'm going to teach you a new workout routine." Nodding, Izuku dug in. They ended up buying him around 6 outfits and 1 tracksuit. It was only semi-difficult to find things in his size. But since there was some people whose quirks just made them smaller, he'd ended up with enough suitable workout clothes. According to his uncle, some people thought it was in bad taste to train younger children to be heroes. Izuku thought that was rather silly, since most kids trained anyways. After all, before they found out he was quirkless, his parents had planned to all live in Tokyo. When he turned, he didn't think he was as smart as Yaoyorozu, but he wasn't stupid. He'd figured out his papa was planning on starting his training at that age. It hurt a bit it took so long to finally start, but he'd made it here so he wouldn't look back. Izuku changed into a new tank top and running shorts along with his shoes and joined his uncle in the dojo for their training session. The first thing he noticed is that there were a lot of cones. Night Eye smiled and announced, "Gran Torino says he's building your stamina and strength. So I've prepared to start off your speed training." A thrill shot through Izuku. He was almost bouncing in excitement. First we'll increase your running stride, then we'll begin increasing your speed in tight spaces with some cone drills that professional athletes would use before quirks. Night Eye adjusted his glasses and smiled. You will be faster than anyone who doesn't have a speed quirk after I'm done with you. Izuku suddenly gulped. His uncle was just as scary as his grandpa. The first task was to cut his time running across the matted area in the dojo in half. Which, once Night Eye taught him how to increase his stride length, wasn't too great of a task. It was a rather tiring leg workout though. The second was learning to keep his footwork tight, as he weaved through a set of lined-up cones, not allowing himself outside of lines set by jump ropes his uncle had placed down. Then they combined these by running the entire perimeter of the dojo. The long sides were to be done in the longest strides he could, and the short ones were lined with cones for weaving through. Afterward, Izuku was sure he'd be dead if his grandpa hadn't started training him already. Good work! Night Eye called out as Izuku crossed the designated finish line and sat on the floor. You did really well today, Izuku. I'm impressed. Let's do some stretches to cool down, and when you've showered we'll get some lunch. Izuku looked up at the sidekick and nodded as he controlled his breathing how his grandpa showed him. After a cool down and shower, Izuku and Night Eye ate a simple lunch of leftover miso from the morning and some chicken and vegetables from the night before. As they ate, Night Eye made a request that Izuku was used to another, special only on vacation, thing that he expected would become a regular occurrence. Izuku, the man began casually, do you think we could go over your notebooks? I'd like to see what you have since Inko says you already finished the first one. Izuku looked at his uncle and smiled a bit slyly. Yaozu has my first notebook, but I can show you the second. Night Eye startled and frowned a bit in what the boy expected was disappointment, then nodded and took a bite of his lunch. I suppose if it can't be helped I'll have to settle for only one. Izuku laughed at the almost pout on his uncle's face and ate his own food. Suddenly, without warning, he thought of his papa. He wondered if he was okay. If they were still working on him. If Mama was going to spend the night at the hospital with him, and Izuku was suddenly so sad he began crying. His uncle was with him in a second, and while he wasn't one to throw caution to the wind and hug the boy, he did offer an arm over his shoulder and let Izuku cry on him a bit. Izuku hiccuped. He had been having so much fun with his uncle he'd almost forgotten, and he felt so awful. Why are you crying, Izuku? The sidekick asked, and Izuku blubbered a bit before answering. Papa's having surgery and I'm here laughing with you and having fun. I should dash. Izuku, you don't have to be doing anything, remember? Night Eye reminded him. I designed today to keep your mind from worrying, Izuku. I've kept you moving all day to make sure you'd never be too worried, but I guess now that we've had a break you've had some time to think about it. I suppose I failed. Suddenly Izuku realized what this morning's talk had been. His uncle had been trying to comfort him before he actually had to, and just cried more because he was so lucky to have so many people who loved him. After a moment more of crying, Night Eye let the boy clean his face. Izuku declared with the most determined smile he could muster, all right. I want to show you my notebook, okay? You can tell me what to add. I left space for your notes. Night Eye smiled back. I can't wait. The boy was as he had remembered. A spot of light in an unseemly dark time. Always so worried about others and barely caring for himself, with a brilliant smile that could rally the heart of even him. Izuku was sleeping now, and Night Eye thought the boy deserved it. Whatever Gran Torino had been teaching the boy, it was working. No one with the scores Izuku got the first time he'd been graded by the retired hero should have gotten the scores Izuku got today on the speed test. He had a monstrous work ethic, and Night Eye made a mental note to make sure the boy wouldn't overwork himself at any point. Tomorrow they'd begin working on his self-image and a bit of confidence. Izuku was better than Night Eye remembered, with that at least. Usually getting him to see his notebooks was like pulling teeth. To hear he'd shared it with a classmate and even lent it to them spoke volumes. He both trusted that girl and had gotten a bit of a confidence boost somewhere along the way. He suspected it was the hero training. If he worked half as hard for Gran Torino than he worked today, then the older man was giving him loads of praise, and that would go a very long way. He clamped down on the desire to see where it would go. Before, the boy inherited one for all, but after Izuku had grown into the person he should be, Only then would Sir Night-Eye peer into the boy's future. Not a day sooner. He put himself up in the guest room and hooked up the home phone in there and set it on the nightstand. Being across the hall from Izuku would allow him to hear if he'd be needed. Naomasa liked sleeping on the couch in case of intruders. He'd rather be closer to Izuku and further from the door to form a plan. It was rather late, but not so late that he wasn't up on his laptop scanning the news when the phone rang. Immediately he dropped everything he was doing and answered, not just because he was eager but he'd rather not Izuku be woken at this hour of night. "Inko," was his hopeful and first response. Luckily the woman replied from the other side, "He's been out of surgery but I didn't want to call you till he was awake. They said this should be it but just in case of any unforeseen complications we'll have to be ready for him to heal again and get one more session under the knife sometime after he's healed and healthy enough." Letting himself relax and sitting on the bed I took off his glasses and with his free hand rubbed his eyes. "Will you be staying with him tonight?" "Yes." "Thank you so much Dash." "Inko, it's nothing to worry about," he assured. "Izuku is a precious piece of the future. I don't mind caring for him at all. He gives me hope in these dark times." He could hear the woman he respected so much begin crying on the other side of the line. This was one of the reasons why he didn't mind Izuku crying so much. Inko had a heart of iron and steel in her bones with compassion to spare for multitudes. Most people wouldn't recognize those tears as part of a strong heart sadly. So he set up a bit of hope that Izuku would be able to prevent himself from crying so much in public at least. "Night-Eye, he says thank you as well. He said he wanted you to know he's counting on you." Night-Eye sighed away from the phone then replied, "Inko, make sure you get some rest, okay? I'm sure you've had a really rough day and you deserve it, okay?" "Of course I will, and you do too, Night-Eye. I know what it's like spending all day chasing that boy, so you get some sleep because you have another round of it tomorrow." "Of course." With a quick goodbye he hung up the phone and shut down his computer. He had not need to stay up any longer. He'd gotten what he was waiting for. The next day was a Sunday and Izuku once again found himself in his uncle's care. Woken up with a knock on his door and a declaration of, "Get up, we're going out for breakfast and spending the day at the park." Izuku quickly threw on another all-might shirt, shorts, shoes, and was off. His uncle was dressed in slacks and a polo shirt and was toting around a yellow, red, and blue backpack that Izuku was mighty suspicious if he'd voiced it and got a good laugh for his troubles. That might have been because he said, "I have an almighty suspicious feeling about that bag of yours." Breakfast was a quick affair, something traditional and light. Night-Eye had informed him that his mother was actually home and had gotten there just before he'd dragged him out of bed for breakfast. But she was now resting and they were going to do their best to give her a rest day. Izuku was 100% supportive of that idea. She'd been able to support Papa all day yesterday, so now they were supporting her. Getting to the park, the contents of the all-might colored bag was revealed. Out from it emerged 2 notebooks and 2 pens. "We're going to write down all the good things you've achieved and things you're skilled at, okay? Make sure to list every accomplishment you can think of, no matter if you think it's silly or small." Night-Eye requested as he handed over a notebook and pen. The two were seated in a rather secluded area, seeing as it was a Sunday and full of families and teenagers playing sports. Izuku nodded, taking the notebook and writing utensil, and immediately froze, having no idea where to begin. Casting a glance at his uncle, he found the man writing furiously. What was he writing? Was it his own accomplishments? That part hadn't been very clear. Izuku frowned, then looked at his notebook and wrote, "Made friends with Yaoyorozu," and just stared at it. Was there a time limit? Nothing was really coming to him, so he just waited a bit, and finally when Night-Eye stopped writing, the man also announced, "Now we're going to switch notebooks." "What? Why?" Izuku cried out, rather startled. "We're going to compare lists. We both wrote about you. I want to see what you think of as accomplishments and skills compared to what others see." The man smiled. Something in Izuku's body left him. All that time his uncle had been writing things about him. Night-Eye offered his notebook, and Izuku, seeing no other option, traded it with his own. There was a H from Night-Eye's camp, and Izuku didn't know if that was good or bad. Part of him was scared of what his uncle had written in his notebook. So inhaling and preparing himself, he flipped it over and read, Wrote 1 and 1-2 detailed hero analysis notebooks. Able to analyze most heroes in only 1 or 2 fights. Got A's and B's even though he missed almost a month and a half of school. Made a friend on the first day of school. Shared the notebook with a friend even though you're shy. Did good on first day ever of speed training. Learned how to cook to help mom with food. Was able to get up early to see father off. Got night eye to laugh 2 days in a row. Pretty good with puns. Trains every Tuesday through Saturday. He could feel the tears coming, none of that felt any special. It was what he'd always done. He'd worked hard to make people proud and he was supposed to be good and help people, wasn't he? But that's all just normal everyday things. That's all things I did because it was the right thing. Izuku cried, tears spilling over. Looking up at night, he saw the man smiling right back. Those things are things to be proud of, Izuku. Because you're a really amazing kid. Izuku couldn't help it then. Leaned over and hugged Night Eye for all he was worth. Toshinori was on the mend once again. The doctor had said he would need 1 more set of surgeries if things still didn't look too hot when he was mended. He hoped that it wouldn't come to that. All Might had already been virtually unseen for too long. Recovery Girl kept saying he was going to kill himself, but honestly he was doing his best with what he had. Honestly he knew that if it wasn't for Inko and Izuku he'd probably already be out in the streets saving people. Even if it was only 1 or 2 incidents a day, he would be trying to make himself be seen. He was finally getting to see Izuku train with Gran Torino and Night Eye. He was doing so well it made him ache. Toshinori wanted to be the one teaching him these things. All he could do now was offer an encouraging word here and there and do his best not interfere with his friend and mentor's teaching methods. There were so many things he felt left out on. Such as the fact that Gran Torino and Sir Night Eye seemed to think Izuku was progressing phenomenally on all fronts. Watching his son in action, he saw someone growing so fast and it pained him to think of all the growth he'd already missed. Jealousy boiled beneath the surface, but at the end of the day his gratefulness to these 2 wonderful men won hands down. He'd get over it once he himself was overseeing portions of Izuku's training. His son still spent the evenings with him, either at his bedside or in the living room when he was feeling up to relaxing in a chair. He'd grown so weak. After his first round of surgeries he tried to activate One for All. It seemed to put quite strain on his body but it still worked. But right now his body was so much smaller and frailier than before. Recovery Girl told him not to try it when he still had stitches because they might bust from the strain. So he'd have to wait just a bit longer. Life was blurring by and he was vaguely aware of the fact that Izuku would be finishing school for the year soon and he'd curse how fast time had went. Cursed his injuries for not allowing him time with Izuku. But really thinking about it caused him to go full circle and realize if he wasn't so badly hurt Izuku would still be far off and he'd be preparing for his and Inko's visit and he'd get angry all over again for uprooting their lives. He'd be okay. He had talked to Inko about his feelings and she would always reassure but he felt so worthless at the moment. Izuku would fidget about when he thought about his father's recovery and tried not to worry. Besides, today was going to be special. Yaoyorozu was going to come over for a study session. Mama and Gran Torino would be there but his father would be in the room. He couldn't be seen and it made Izuku want to cry. But again he was trying not to worry about it too much. There wasn't anything he could do except wait for him to get better again. So Izuku did his best to gather his wits and help his mama clean up for guests by tidying up his room and the living room. When he did finish his bit of cleaning he made his way to his parents' bedroom, hoping to spend some time with his father before Yaoyorozu would arrive. So with a light knock and a "come in" from the other side Izuku bounded in happily and plopped himself next to his father. "Momo is coming soon and I'm really sad she can't meet you." Izuku sighed as he lay down on his parents' bed next to his papa. He wasn't as big and strong as he used to be but he was still a lot bigger than Izuku and had enough padding for the boy to happily burrow into. His father lifted his arm allowing Izuku to press against him and sighed. "I want to meet her too. She seems like a really good friend and your grandpa seems to think she's good for you." The hero smiled and Izuku grumbled a bit discontentedly. "But it's not just you meeting my friend." Izuku sighed. "I miss going places with you, Papa." The man ruffled Izuku's hair and coughed a bit. "We'll go places again, Izuku, don't worry. I know I keep saying, just wait, but I mean it. I'm going to take you to the duck park the moment that I'm well enough. Izuku nodded a bit sedately and his papa continued, besides I miss going places with you too. This caused him to look up at his father in surprise. He'd thought there were other, probably more important things for him to be worried about. He was a hero who currently couldn't save people, and the number one at that, a place that wouldn't hold itself open for him. But I'm not that important, he whispered it, half hoping his father wouldn't hear him, half praying he would. Izuku, you are the most important thing in my life, was the quick and rather resolute reply. I will always want to spend time with you. Never ever doubt that you are important. He could feel tears forming and prickling at the corners of his eyes, and for the first time dared to think that all those talks he and his Uncle Night Eye had been having in the park about him being important were true. When Momo arrived, Izuku gave his father a hug and happily made his way to the living room. The two friends did their homework together on the coffee table while sitting on pillows and compared their work while his grandpa was on the couch watching an animal documentary and his mama made dinner in the kitchen. When they finished, they both sat on the couch and the retired hero surrendered the remote and disappeared. Izuku assumed he'd joined his father and was probably watching the news on the small portable TV that was in his parents' room. Momo had happily skimmed through the TV guide and Izuku channel surfed, and in no time at all the two settled on watching How It's Made, which was currently showing the process of making pressure gauges and inorganic pigments. Which was actually quite useful, he supposed. Momo seemed excited by it and had taken out her notebook and pencil and was jotting down everything she could. During a commercial break she turned to him and said, "Your mom has such a useful quirk." Momo had been peeking into the kitchen periodically and now he knew why. When him mom needed to, she could float up a decent amount of peas. The most he'd seen was 4 and that was a lot for her. Yes, she makes the most of it. It's really useful, she's really busy and something she needs is out of her reach. Izuku laughed and continued, "My papa used to say when I was born she could float me, but I'm pretty sure he was just joking." Momo smirked and turned to focus back on the TV but kind of peered at him from the side of her eye. "It's not a very good quirk for being a hero, but that's okay. I guess it would be good for like support." Izuku's heart might have stopped for a moment. He'd known she was curious about his quirk, but she wasn't a bully. She wouldn't beg it out of him or call him out in front of their whole class like he thought Ando might do at some point. But here in the privacy of his home he'd kind of figured she'd try to make an opening for him to share with her. They were really good friends after all. Yeah. She was disappointed that I didn't at least get part of it. He replied as casually as he could, trying to pretend like he was talking about the weather. It wasn't a lie either. His mama had been very sad he'd been quirkless. Momo nodded and continued watching their program for a bit before continuing. "I found out that 20% of the world is quirkless. I looked it up cause Ando was always saying that about you, and since your parents both have quirks is really unlikely. But it can still happen, so she's just being insensitive. 20% is a lot of people." She looked at him and he nodded. "She doesn't know my parents have quirks though." He wished his grandpa was here. He kind of wanted to ask him mom if dinner was almost ready, but that would probably be rude and he didn't want to leave his friend thinking he was trying to run away from the conversation even if he was kind of. So he pulled out the biggest weapon he had, courtesy of his grandpa. "You know my papa couldn't properly use his quirk until he was about 14? It's not really normal, but he's really strong and he couldn't use it too much when he first got it, so it took a while to get the hang of it." He said it all with a straight face. This was one thing his grandpa had made him memorize word for word. Everything else he could memorize the gist of, but this his grandpa had said was important to get right. "I won't have you lying to no one to keep us old folks' business private." He'd thought it was weird, but they'd tell him when he was ready, like they did with everything else in his life. He wasn't stupid, but when it came to his papa's quirk, he easily knew more than anybody he would ever meet, but less than anyone else in the family. He was in an area of half-knowledge for his protection, and it ate him up with curiosity, so he'd sit quiet till it was time to be told. Momo's eyes narrowed because Izuku knew she also wasn't stupid and realized that wasn't really an answer. But she nodded in acceptance and just said, "Cool." When he told Papa about Momo for the first time, he told him to keep an eye on her because she seemed like a proper friend. He hadn't really known what he'd meant, but the fact that she just left the subject after all that probably had something to do with it. It was something Kachin would never have done if he'd known his father was all might. The two of them just sat happily for a while when the front door behind them swung open and a call of, "Izuku, I have a gift for you," came bellowing from only a few feet away. There was a crash from the kitchen and a call of, "Knight? Did you just yell in this house?" Izuku peeked over the back of the couch and saw his uncle as expected holding a set of hoodies that looked like his father's hero costume. It reminded him of his old onsen pajama. His uncle meekly replied, "I'm sorry, Inko." At the same time he heard a snort and unstoppable laughter in the seat next to him. Izuku looked at his couch companion who was pointing at him giggling. "Izuku!" She laughed, "It's perfect." Izuku stared at her in exasperation, of all the things to focus on. Feeling embarrassed, he replied with most deadpan voice he could muster, "If you call me that, I'm going to call you Emo-chun." This time it was Night's turn to laugh. By the time Toshinori was well enough to go anywhere with Izuku again, his son had finished his second term of school and it was already the last day of winter break. Since it was winter, the ducks at Shinabazu Pond in Ueno Park were no longer there and had migrated to their warmer homes for the season. So the plan was a tad bit altered to fit the time of year. Toshinori got up rather early and with the help of Inko put together a small basket lunch for a picnic. Another change to the plan. She refused to let the two of them go alone, and that was fine by him. He knew he was pushing his time frame. He'd only just been allowed light exercises that included a very small amount of stretches and a brisk walking routine. He'd had a session with Recovery Girl to check if he could still activate One for All properly. It seemed that his activating it for short times in his limbs during his recovery aided him because while he was currently much smaller than he was before his fight with All for One, his body would swell to accommodate the power. Recovery Girl gave him tenuous permission to activate his quirk for 10 minutes a day to keep his body in practice during the next stages of recovery. He had hoped for longer, but he wasn't about to argue with her. Toshinori only hoped that his body would keep up as it began shrinking even more. The fact that he'd never be able to get back in shape was going to kill his plans to remain all might if it couldn't. Shaking those thoughts away, he wrapped himself in a warm coat as Izuku came barreling into the living room brimming with excitement and happiness. The boy's smile was bright and it gave Toshinori a sense of contentment. Izuku was smiling a lot more these days. Night Eye had told Inko he'd been giving their son self-image lessons in the local family park as part of their training, and it really showed. Izuku had been more open since that day. He'd confessed he didn't think he was that important. He'd also been quicker to smile and laugh about everyday things. It warmed Toshinori's heart and kind of made him jealous that he couldn't be the one to help his son. Well, his son was happier and that's all that really mattered in the end. The three departed and trudged happily down their street. Toshinori wore his coat and a scarf wrapped up covering half his face, and Izuku held his hand and chattered about the things he had been learning from his training. Inko held their son's other hand happily. The three earned a few odd looks for the affectionate gesture, but those people were just ignored. Toshinori listened and replied with his thoughts when prompted as he guided them both to the train station. Inko was laughing with Izuku and begun playing a game of I Spy. They rode the train and Izuku told them about the last time he'd come with Gran Torino and how he'd played taiyaki roulette. Reaching their destination, the family departed the train. Privately, Toshinori was glad they were almost there. He was beginning to get tired from all the walking and being in the presence of a crowded train. Inko was casting him concerned glances and keeping Izuku well occupied in the meantime. The trio spread the blanket together laughing and talking about everything and nothing. They ate their lunch, then took a small turn about the park. Izuku was pointing at the clouds as they walked. "That one kind of looks like a dog," he declared while indicating a particularly fluffy cloud. Inko laughed and nodded and Toshinori could see it. He supposed, "Maybe, it might just be an angry cat though." Izuku snorted at his joke, replying, "It's a poodle." Toshinori nodded sagely, "Ah, of course." Inko looked at them both as if they were only half as funny as they thought they were. By the end of it, Toshinori was exhausted, but a deep happiness had settled in his bones. It had been far too long since the three of them had gone anywhere, and this really was perfect. This was living, and not to mention the happiest he'd been in years. As they packed up, there was a ruckus beginning to stir in the direction of the street. Shouting could be heard and loud noises were beginning to sound. Izuku immediately looked at him, then in the direction of the sounds, picnic blanket clutched in his hands, a rather small concerned look on his face. His son's eyes widened and he took a step back. Toshinori turned to see a massive vine crushing cars in the street. A villain. Fighting every instinct to go and help, he turned to Izuku, his priority. Inko had picked the boy up and was staring at him with ice in her eyes. Then someone cried, "Hero! We need a hero!" His wife smiled so beautifully at him and said, "Recovery girl said you have 10 minutes. And he was off. The villain was dealt with in less than 2 minutes. Getting off the scene was the more difficult part. The press was a wave that was chasing down the formerly missing hero, and he'd hoped to God he'd escaped them, but people were watching. Inko and Izuku rushed out as quickly as they could. He didn't power down until he had reached the train station and had his family in his arms. It had only been 8 minutes. After they all met back at the train station, they found a safe and hidden place for All Might to power down. They, Inko and Izuku, boarded the train and his papa followed them by a good 10 minutes. That was supposed to be the end of it. Izuku, dressed into his uniform for the first day of school the next morning, boarded a train with his mother and entered the building unceremoniously. He walked through the halls and came to the room for his class and entered already thinking about his plans for the day when the chatter of the entire room ceased. Momo, who was at the back of the room, stood up and gasped, "Izuku, what are you doing here?" Then Ando practically leaped over the other desks in the classroom and shouted in his face with a sneer, "Show us a smash." The rest of the class collectively lost their cool and began shouting things as well. Things like, "Is All Might really your dad? Is All Might cool? How strong is he really? Do you have his quirk? What is his quirk anyways? You have to know." And the list went on and on. Izuku stared at all of them and laughed a hollow, shaky laugh. Hold on. What are you all talking about?" He chuckled, his stomach was churning and his hands had begun to shake. Emo-chan looked impressed that he'd even replied. He thanked his grandpa and uncle silently for preparing him for this. Izuku had hoped he'd be able to laugh and treat it all like a game by the time it happened, but he wasn't that skilled at smiling yet. Mrs. Nida entered the room, frowned at the commotion. "All of you get into your seats right now." The teacher then noticed him and looked surprised but quickly smiled. "I'm surprised you're here, Yagi." "Well, go sit down then." Izuku, still confused as could be, made his way to the back of the room and sat in front of Momo. The class never fully settled and there was an undercurrent of a restless buzz and small whispers, people casting glances at him, talking about him. His friend leaned forward and whispered as quietly as she could so as not to get the teacher's attention. "This morning on the news, there was video of you and your parents at the train station after All Might stopped that plant villain. You didn't see it?" Izuku tensed. Someone had seen them? He wanted to turn to Momo and scream. The glances were increasing and he felt like his blood was going to expand and blow his hair off. Later he would think it was funny that his primary concern was people seeing his father powered down. He was worried about his mother, who'd had no connection to All Might whatsoever until now. All the whispers about that were starting to kick up again, and all he was worried about was his parents. He was running down what could possibly been recorded in his head. So much had happened at the train station, but the only time they had all been together was when his father returned to the station and came to them in the small alcove he and his mama had waited in. That's the only time. After that they'd promptly separated and not been together again until the walk home. By then his papa was powered down and almost fully covered from head to toe. Toshinori woke to his wife in a grand uproar. She'd come to their room and woken him up and simply panicked. After she'd been calmed down enough to explain, she opened her news feed on her phone and showed him. A video was being shown on the popular morning show, Tokyo Sunrise. It showed him arriving at the train station in a flurry and lifting up his son in a familiar embrace. His wife, who had been scolding him, touched his arm gently and he'd put Izuku down and planted an almost too quick kiss on her head, and the video ended with them vanishing into the shadows. The only audio was the chatter of the station, and the camera was of decent quality, but it was from a slight distance and anyone who knew of him could recognize who he was. Inko was the blurriest, but there was a good solid moment when he lifted Izuku when he and his son came into sharp focus, then blurred out again. According to the newscaster, a man who'd been out with his family had taken it with his camcorder and wanted to be anonymous. Privately, Toshinori wondered what kind of man with a family, who could possibly empathize, would be willing to expose such a private moment. It really didn't matter in the end. What mattered was that Inko had already taken Izuku to school and Night Eye was in their kitchen on the phone with approximately 500 people, including Endeavor's agency. This was a bit of a nightmare. It's not a very good idea for you or Inko to go get him from school. Gran Torino announced from the place he's perched on the kitchen table. The kitchen was occupied by him, Sir Night Eye, and Inko. Toshinori found himself leaning against the counter as he nodded his agreement. Izuku has missed so much school, is it really a good idea to take him out? Inko frowned. He's safe there, right? Night Eye shook his head. The fact is he's a brand new toy in the eyes of the press and we have no idea what they'll do. Add that to any villains who think 10 is a small enough number to try something, then you have a recipe for disaster. We need to set up an interview and fast as both a deterrent toward those who'd harm him and to begin building your image as a family man who cares more about the well-being of his wife and child than fame. Gran Torino announced, it'll be the truest depiction of All Might the press will have had in years, and while this is a mess of a situation, it makes him a bit happy that it's finally happening even if it's in such a chaotic manner. Night Eye adjusted his glasses and turned to Inko thoughtfully. Inko, who do you think we can trust to pick up Izuku without causing a fuss? No doubt there is press already outside his school. There was a very clear shot of him in that video. Toshinori sighed. The press could be such vultures sometimes. It was one thing to interview heroes and monitor their every move. They'd made the decision for their job to be an icon in society. But for the press to follow a child around? He wondered how Endeavor did it. It had been a few years, but he was tempted to ask him after all this was over. Maybe. Inko wrung her hands and worried her lip as she considered the few options she had. Since Tsukwachi is nowhere near us, I'd trust the Yairoses the most. Call them, Gran Torino instructed. No doubt every hero who knows you is waiting for their phone to ring, be it with bated breath, excitement, or worry. Tears began forming in Inko's eyes. I should have checked the news before I took him. I always check, and the one time I didn't, this happens. Toshinori was by his wife's side in moments, wrapping his arms around her. He held her and let her cry on him. The hero rested his head on top of hers and whispered words of comfort. Inko, it's not your fault. The person who wanted to make quick money by selling a video of a private moment is to blame. And me to some extent if I had just resisted coming over to you in that station and given you our regular signal. Inko smacked his arm lightly then and frowned, tears still on her cheeks but no longer running so profusely. If I can't blame myself, then neither can you. She had a pretty good point, one that he wasn't about to argue with, so he just nodded and said, okay. He didn't let her go. Not even when she made the call to Mrs. Yairose, who was still at their agency, and asked if she could pick up Izuku. Not when they agreed to all meet at All Might's agency. He only let her go when it was time to leave. Mrs. Nida was having a hard time keeping order. Considering the fact that they all just found out that All Might may have a secret son that went to school with them, he was surprised she'd kept them at such a low chatter. Principal Shoku entered the room, causing the chatter to stop and attention to be diverted to the newcomer. The principal handed Mrs. Nida a piece of paper and immediately her eyes locked onto him. Yagi, you and Yairose are to pack your things and come with me, you're both leaving early. It was like he was back at his old school and reliving that awful moment from almost a whole year ago, and Kachin was turned around sneering at him for interrupting class, and suddenly he was feeling very sick. Emo-chan grabbed his attention by touching his shoulder and had a concerned look across her face. Izuku, come on, we're going to get out of here finally. Izuku forced himself to breathe and nodded. With shaking hands he grabbed his things and left with Momo. Principal Shoku led them to the administration office silently, and Izuku took strength from Momo's presence. He was startled to find only Momo's mother waiting for them. Mrs. Yairose handed Izuku one of his jackets and a ball cap while she smiled at him softly. Yagi, you're going to have to put this on and cover your head the best you can, okay? We have to take the bus to your father's agency. With a "yes ma'am," he donned the hoodie and plopped the hood over his now hatted head. Mrs. Yaoyorozu seemed to sign about a dozen papers and handed the secretary a manila envelope before finally taking them out of the school and to the bus stop. It was easy to make himself small on the bus ride because he felt pretty sick and didn't think his voice would actually work right that moment. Momo kept casting him reassuring glances and it helped a lot, but he ultimately wanted to see his parents. They left the bus about 2 blocks from their destination, and when they did get to his father's agency there was an absolute sea of reporters. "Yagi," Mrs. Yaoyorozu said to get his attention away from fiddling with his bracelet, "I need you to take my hand and just look at the floor, okay? Don't look up no matter what happens." Her firmness intensity reminded him of his mother and it comforted him. So he nodded and focused on his feet. Mrs. Yaoyorozu grabbed his hand and then in the other grabbed Momo's and pushed through the sea of reporters. Izuku never heard her speak to them once, but waves of people made way for them and he wondered what her face must have looked like that it physically caused people to move. When they got into the building, his mother ran to him and lifted him in giant hug and squeezed him as tightly as she possibly could. When she put him down, his father also embraced him tightly. Distantly he heard his uncle say, "You brought your daughter. Perfect. It'd be bad if she was harassed for information by their classmates. Are you okay?" His mother asked as she held his face in her hands. Izuku laid his left hand over hers and smiled. "Yeah, I'm fine. I just wanted to see you and Papa." His father chuckled and ruffled his hair. All of the adults settled into the office area of the building with the exclusion of his uncle Night Eye, who stayed with him, and Momo and Mrs. Yaoyorozu, who was in the corner and seemed to be on the phone with Momo's dad. Night Eye took Izuku and Momo to the workout mat and had them sit cross-legged and accompanied them on the floor. "Your parents and Gran Torino are trying to figure out who to give an interview to for this incident," Night Eye informed him and adjusted his glasses. "We'd have preferred this not happen for another few months, but that doesn't matter, so I've been assigned to teach you how to handle an actual interview. Yaoyorozu can learn as well since it's a valuable skill to have." Momo nodded excitedly and smiled at her friend. Izuku inhaled and said, "I feel sick." Night Eye nodded. "That's expected. You are still very young, Izuku, but for the interview we're going to need you to smile like a hero. Do you think you can do that?" Izuku looked at his hands, clenched them. All the nervousness inside of him was making him shake again, and he didn't want to feel that way anymore. "I'll do my best," was his firm reply. Night Eye smiled. "First you must know that you will always be afraid. Fear is what keeps you safe. Bravery is not the lack of fear but is a product of it." Both children nodded and Izuku began taking mental notes to write down later. His uncle continued his speech. "You must smile to help yourself to feel brave and help give hope to those around you feel brave too. Do you understand?" Izuku had nodded. It was a speech he'd heard before so many times from his papa and his grandpa. Smile to trick the fear inside you. But that was a lot harder than it sounded. He looked at Momo and she practically had stars in her eyes. The former sidekick studied them, then continued, "So Izuku, I'm going to ask you some questions and you must smile and never waver, do you understand?" Izuku inhaled and exhaled. His uncle had recently told him to start smiling when he was exercising to help him with this. Grandpa kept saying, "Fake it till you make it," and he was honestly already getting frustrated. Night Eye kept telling him not to worry, that they had time. But now they didn't anymore and he absolutely needed to smile. With a nod they began to practice. Night Eye asked questions such as, "So what is it like being the son of the #1 hero? What's your hero name going to be? Who's your favorite hero besides your dad? What's your favorite thing you do with your dad?" Of course he failed and began shaking and muttering, imagining having to answer to a perfect stranger. His uncle was kind though and would stop and start again, but after a couple tries Izuku was getting a bit disheartened. "Izuku, maybe you should focus on something to make yourself smile." Momo supplied, "My mom always said when you're scared you should think of what makes you happy." Izuku stared at her and said, "Momo, you're a genius." Sir Night Eye adjusted his glasses. "That's actually a very good idea, Yaoyorozu. Izuku feels very deeply, and if he were to focus on something as a way to ground himself it might be effective. Izuku, let's do this one more time and try Yaoyorozu's method, okay? Think of something and tell me when you're ready." Izuku nodded and thought for a bit. What was something that was strong enough not to be scared anymore? Something to focus on. Closing his eyes, he sifted through all the things that made him happy and kept coming back to his family. He was always so nervous and worried for them. Izuku knew he kept messing up because he was worried he'd answer wrong and embarrass them, and suddenly he knew what to do. He'd smile and think of all the love he had for his family. He'd turn all that love that made him worry into a blade. The love they'd all given up till now had brought him so far, and they all believed in him. He'd smile to show that all that love between them was stronger than anything he could face. That he was worthy of all the faith they put in him. Focusing and gathering all the best and happiest memories he could, and he smiled. Night Eye began the interview, and it wasn't perfect, but a shy but bright smile was still a smile. Izuku sees the video clip for the first time when he got home. His parents show him so that he knows exactly what everyone saw. He's not allowed to watch the news that night. Apparently their interview has been set up for the next day by a man named Nedzu, who is the principal of UA. Izuku wonders a bit at that but decides to ask later. He's tired and he wants to sleep for the next forever. While his mom orders out because according to her, there is no way I am going to cook after a day like this. The three of them sat in the living room and just breathed for a moment. He can tell they are trying to distract themselves and him, if only for a little bit, when his papa decided they should all play a game. It's been some time since they all played something together, but now is as good a time as any. So they all gear up and his mother and father set up the video game console. They played a game of Mario Party with a computer that was on the medium setting until their food arrived. Dinner was pretty quiet and simple but goes by quickly, and before he knows it he's tucked up in bed staring at the ceiling hoping tomorrow is kind and that they all make it out fine. He doesn't dream that night. The next morning they had an early start. Toshinori knew that their reply to the entire situation needed to be as prompt as possible, so they're doing the interview right now in the small hours of the morning when it's still dark out. Recovery Girl had taken a red-eye trip to their home to examine him and determine whether or not he can be fully present for the interview and for how long. Distantly he can hear Inko waking their son in another room, and he prays he can be there for the entire thing. Offering their son the comfort of parent as best she could. He'd do his part and be strong for them as well. Night Eye has been up since 2 in the morning, has been helping one of Grip's set up lighting in his agency. It's 3 a.m. now and their interview is at 4:30 a.m. The nurse has been prodding him and poking him and scolding him for yesterday's stun for a while when she finally steps back and shakes her head. As much as I don't want to, I can clear you for about 3 hours. Anything more might be pushing it. Do you understand, Toshinori? After nodding he put his shirt, that was discarded on the bed, back on, and replied, "Thank you very much. I'll make sure to keep the time down." Recovery Girl gave him a stern look and shook her head. "In about 4 months we can see if you can go any longer than that, okay? You'll have to come to UA though so I can monitor you properly. I'll talk to Inko about it." He smiled, but it sounds like a good plan. As the healing heroine began collecting her things, he leaves her to her work and departs from the guest bedroom that she'd converted to a checkup area. Entering the living room he immediately saw Inko and Izuku putting on their coats for their trip. "I wish we didn't have to do this so early in the morning." Inko sighed as she helped Izuku bundle himself up. "I know." Toshinori smiled and kissed her gently. The magazine Heroes Initiative is going to be printing an exclusive issue just for this interview though. No doubt they're scrambling as well. "How long are you cleared for, Toshi?" Inko asked tiredly. "Only 3 hours, but I think we can do it in that time," he answered while he put his own coat on and earned an accepting nod as his wife began helping him into his clothes. Inko took Izuku's hand as he opened the door and the three of them made their way to the train. It was going to be the longest 3 hours of his life and he knew it. It was such a dangerous thing for heroes to have children in the limelight. Most of other children of heroes had been in the public eye from the moment they were born. The media would then get glimpses of them as they grew older by virtue of having a hero as a parent. It happened sometimes. But All Might was the current #1 hero, arguably the greatest hero of all time. And he'd hidden everything. The media wasn't about to forgive them. Their family was going to be very tense for a while, even after this was over and done with. Hopefully Izuku would be reduced to blurry image like all the rest of the hero's children when the dust had settled. Izuku had been nervous when his mother woke him up and had a rather upset stomach for his troubles. She was so soothing and comforting as she hugged him and pressed her cheek into his hair. "Izuku, don't worry, okay? This is the only time it will ever be this bad. It's because we kept you a secret for so long." She explained to him, and he hadn't even asked, she just seemed to know what he was worried over. "They won't ask about your quirk, they won't ask about Papa's. The most important question they should ask you today is what you want your hero name to be." His mama soothed and began rubbing his back. "And they're not even going to use our real names, okay? They're only going to put the video on their website and it's not going to be the whole interview, so don't you worry at all, Izuku. Just remember we love you, and no matter what happens or what anyone says, we are the proudest parents in the world to have been given you." Izuku clutched his mother and didn't cry. It was a close thing because oh goodness gracious had he wanted to cry. But no tears were forthcoming, and it was probably because he felt the safest when one of his parents were wrapped around him and sharing their love with him. They met his father in the living room and were on their way. When they arrived at All Might's agency, they entered through the back so the reporters who were still camped out from yesterday didn't catch sight of them. They entered into a private room closed off from where the Heroes Initiative crew were waiting for them. Sir Nighthigh offered a quick greeting upon their arrival, along with a page of questions that had been vetted by him personally. The look the man was wearing on his face would have had Izuku thinking his uncle hadn't slept if he hadn't spent the night in the guest bedroom after all the chaos of yesterday. His family ran through the questions and answers they'd mapped out almost the entire interview, and Izuku felt like he'd been swept up in a whirlwind, and if his mother and father hadn't placed him between them, he thought he might have been swept away by it all. Before he knew it, his father was powering up and he was being hoisted up, placed on his papa's shoulders, and brought into the main room of the agency. They made their way down the hallway and Izuku could see the place they had set up for the interview at the end of it. Izuku had never seen so many lights pointed at such a small space in his entire life, and he saw about 3 cameras also aimed at the same target, which was a set of 3 chairs all placed closely together and another one just a couple feet from them. Inhaling deeply, he recited that he was important and an interesting kid like his uncle kept telling him, and that he was full of his family's love and faith, so he would smile and make them proud. Slowly he opened his eyes as they entered the main room, and he smiled just as his family had taught him, even if he felt his heart pounding a mile a minute. His father patted his leg that was draped over his shoulder and said, "Izuku, let's have fun with this, okay?" "Okay," was his enthusiastic reply. The entire ordeal seemed to take forever, with what seemed like endless retakes and rehashes of the same questions. He did his best to keep smiling and remain enthusiastic. At first smiling was difficult, but with his father and mother by his sides to ease his nerves, it slowly became easier. With Sir Night-Eye shooting him approving smiles and a couple thumbs up while his grandpa nodded happily from the sidelines, he began to relax. His mother kept smiling shyly and blushing every time they called her Mrs. Might for the interview, but the crew had began calling her M. Might when the camera wasn't filming, and Izuku tried to stifle his giggles because it sounded so strange, but it fit better than Mrs. Might did. He smiled and laughed with his parents, and when it was over he fell asleep on the train home. The family took a nap when they got him. Night-Eye and Gran Torino had promised to take care of the cleanup and make sure the magazine crew was gone efficiently. When Izuku finally woke up, it was because his father had come to his room to bring him down to breakfast. It must have been a while because his uncle Night-Eye and Grandpa were also there. His uncle was smiling and complimenting his mother, saying, "Really, Inko, you held yourself so well, it was like you'd done it 1,000,000 times. People will love the idea of All Might married to someone so traditional and sweet." Grandpa was nodding. "All of you held yourself with dignity and the quiet grace of a happy family who just wanted privacy. You did great." Izuku, who was holding his father's hand being led to the kitchen, smiled because his mom was blushing and telling the 2 men, "Stop it. You're making me embarrassed. I wasn't anything special." When he reached the kitchen, he released his father's hand so he could sit at his place at the table and his father could aid his mother in serving everyone. "Izuku, you did so well." Night-Eye smiled at him. The man looked less exhausted than he did this morning, and Izuku figured he had probably also taken some sort of nap. It relieved him of the stray worry he had felt about his uncle's appearance earlier. It's because everyone has taught me so much, Izuku declared. It really wasn't any of his own doing, so he put credit where it was due. Night Eye and Grandpa looked at him like they wanted to say something, but his papa was the one to reply first, saying, "Just because someone teaches you doesn't mean you'll be any good at it, Izuku. It was your hard work that pulled it off in the end, and we're proud of you." Izuku blushed and nodded his acceptance of the compliments. They all kind of just spent the day relaxing, and for Izuku it was kind of strange for neither his grandpa or uncle to leave. While their visits were normal, they never really stayed all day, and the only time they did was when they were caring for him, and they only spent the night when their business had brought them over late. So having them over all day was strange, but it made him feel good to have his entire family together supporting each other after such a wild event. In the evening he asked his parents if it'd be alright if he called Momo, because while his entire family was okay, he didn't want to worry her either. At first Mr. Yaoyorozu answered, but happily transferred the phone over to his daughter when he realized it was Izuku calling. Momo answered rather intensely with, "Izuku, how did it all go?" Izuku laughed a bit, still tired from everything even if he'd had a day to relax. "Everything went fine, Imogen. They're putting the magazine out tomorrow, but there's a video that went up this afternoon on their website." His friend made a noise, and Izuku knew she was nodded, probably in approval. "I'm glad you're okay. You get so nervous, I was worried something would happen." "No way," Izuku replied. "Not with you and my whole family helping me out. You really saved me, Momo. It's because of you I figured out how to keep smiling." "Nope," she said in much the same way she'd explained the things she'd learned to make perfectly with her quirk. "You would have got it even without me. You're smart too, you know." A bubble of warmth formed and he smiled again. If this is what having a friend meant, he didn't think he could handle more than one. They began talking about other things, and soon they had to say goodbye. Izuku paused to think that now the whole entire world knew who he was now. Did Kachin watch the video and recognize him? How many of the kids from his old neighborhood saw him with his papa on that website? How many of them had made fun of him for having a father that was away being a hero? Izuku began laughing thinking about it, and suddenly he was crying from relief. In moments his father's arms were around him, and once again he thought that's where he was safest. Right in his dad's arms. A mighty family. Unarguably, All Might is the #1 hero in the country and in our hearts. But recently, due to an over-eager fan, we have discovered that maybe a couple of particular someones that are #1 in his. It's my first time being in All Might's agency, and there's something about it that makes you feel like something epic is happening. Maybe it's knowing that the big #1 hero himself spends his days here, or maybe it's the buzz of the camera crew and Sir Night Eye himself setting up for the occasion. When the family enters the room, I have to double-take because, discounting the impressive figure All Might cuts, it's easy to see how this family has escaped everyone's notice up till now. They look like your average mother and child that you might see on the bus or on the train home from work, and who knows, maybe you have. But today they are the center of attention. Their son, who I refer to as Small Might by his mother's request in the video interview on Out website, is smiling just as brightly as his father and is sitting between both his parents rather contentedly. Mrs. Might seems rather shy but happy to be here. Her priority is obviously the comfort of her son, and All Might himself, who entered with the boy on his shoulders, has an arm rather comfortably stretched across the backs of both his wife and son's chairs. They are the picture of a happy family. I begin with a question that is on everyone's mind. How did you and All Might meet? Mrs. Might smiles and laughs a bit. She has a reminiscent look on her face. He wasn't the All Might when I met him. He was still in his last year of UA and I was going to a local high school. We met taking the train. I noticed him a few times during my commute, and one day there was a villain on the train. Thing happened and well, we became friends and the rest just followed. So he saved you? That's really romantic. All Might's laugh in response is enormous. She saved me. The villain had a minor quirk and a gun on a bus. She was able to pull the gun from his hand before anything bad happened to anyone. You see, her quirk lets her pull objects toward her. She was so brave that day. I fell in love with her, I think. Mrs. Might laughs and is blushing, but she doesn't deny it, and it's quite a story. One I would believe if All Might hadn't told it himself. It's such an interesting tale, I want to hear more, but we have a short time frame, so I move forward. Your son seems very young. How old is he? All Might smiles down at the boy, who is smiling right back at him and has been rather patient through the first two questions. Mrs. Might is the one to respond. He's just turned 10 this year actually. He's growing up so fast he'll be a teenager before I know it. All Might also replies, we are both so proud of him, he's really everything a parent could hope for in a child. He's the best of both of us. So why all the secrecy? Most heroes are excited to share the news when they have children. Both parents collect their thoughts and it's Mrs. Might who says, we wanted him to grow up as much as he could without the cameras or the lights. And even if he didn't draw attention villains, there was still the potential of him growing up isolated because of who his father was. We really thought it was for the best and we stand by that. All Might says, agreeing with his wife. I turn my attention to the boy sitting between them who has been smiling and listening attentively. So, Small Might, what do you think of all this? He smiles and answers enthusiastically. I was worried at first about all the kids at school finding out and trying to ask questions about my papa or bothering my mom, but now I'm just happy papa doesn't have to cover up his face so much when we go places if he doesn't want to. I'm always worried he won't be able to breathe right. He earns a laugh from his parents and our staff. His smile is infectious. What's it like having your dad be such a famous hero? The boy thinks a bit. He doesn't look too worried and quickly smiles again. It's really neat because it means my papa is so cool. He isn't just my hero, he's everybody's. I know when kids at school think their parents are cool, they get made fun of sometimes, but my dad is so cool people will probably just agree with me. He's joking, but it's really obvious he looks up to his father like so many other children his age do. He continues, my hero isn't just a hero on TV. He's my dad and I want to be just like him. He's so sincere. His mother looks a little misty-eyed and All Might looks extremely proud. Do you know what you want your hero name to be? He immediately drops the smile and is very serious and says, not Small Might. Before he's laughing again, this time his father has joined him and their joy is infectious. It seems the kid inherited his dad's sense of humor. What are your plans now that people know you're a family? Our plans haven't changed at all. All Might replies, this just gives us more of an excuse to go out more as a family and not worry too much about being seen. Mrs. Might laughs and says, we'd always been so worried about it. I'd always look for myself in public sightings of him if they'd been taken when I had been around. I was so concerned about the whole thing. We were actually out having a picnic before we'd been spotted, so it's actually amazing that it was at the train station we had been seen. Now I'm so relieved not to have those worries. Our plans, like my husband says, haven't changed at all. I thanked all of them because they've been such a delight to have and wished them a good day. The family leaves just as merrily as when they arrived, and now to me All Might doesn't stick out as much anymore. They just look like your everyday family you might see on the train or bus on your way home from work, and who knows, maybe you have. And prologue.